We're live on YouTube, so we're ready to go.
Jamie, are you ready?
Yes, did you want me to start off opening the meeting, and then did you want to say something about the rebuttal and questioning, or I can cover it?
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead? I mean, what I put in the email is what I was going to reiterate today before we got started, but let's go ahead and start the meeting.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon. My name is Jamie Accurso, and I'm the chair of the Board of Building Appeals. I'd like to take a minute to remind everyone about the rules of this proceeding. This proceeding is at all times governed by the board's rules of procedure. A copy of the rules of procedure can be found online. All those planning to testify today, which does not include those solely making arguments such as attorneys, should stand and take an oath administered by the board's staff attorney. This is a quasi-judicial hearing. As such, the board reserves the right to deliberate in private. The Ohio rules of evidence do not apply to this hearing. However, professional rules of conduct do apply, and candor to the tribunal is required. The board members are citizen volunteers and are not paid for their service. They are treated as public officials under Ohio law. Any attempt to influence them, including but not limited to bribery, intimidation, retaliation, which may include contacting their employer in an attempt to exert influence, is punishable as a crime. All should be aware that this meeting is being tape recorded. Therefore, please speak clearly into your microphone and state your name and address for the record. In the event of any technical difficulties with the video conferencing technology, we can continue or postpone this hearing at my discretion. All participants providing testimony must have both camera and audio features turned on in order to participate. With that said, let's proceed with where we left off last time.
And that portion is rebuttal. And again, to reiterate what I put in the email a couple days ago, that the presentation today from OTR Adopt should be limited to directly rebutting or refuting claims that were made by the church's witnesses during their presentation, and should not include new evidence or evidence that does not, again, directly rebut evidence presented by the church. Jamie, did you want to make any additional admonitions there?
Yeah, and so I think we're going to go through the rebuttal. And then I would like to ask that all the board members, we take an opportunity at that point, at the completion of that rebuttal, to ask any outstanding questions that people have. Obviously, if there's something during the rebuttal that can't wait, let me know, and you can ask it as we go as well. But we'll answer all of those questions, because really we've put a lot of time into this so far, and obviously we want to do this justice, but we need to, get to a conclusion, and would like to be able to provide that today. Is that?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's. I think we're ready to proceed with rebuttal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board, for your time again today. We also would love to see this come to conclusion, and that's the plan for this afternoon. We have two rebuttal witnesses that we are going to call, Ms. Paula Dombrowski, followed by Danny Klingler. So if Ms. Paula Dombrowski, if you could unmute and prepare to testify. Does she need to be sworn in again, Mr. Sturkey?
Let's just do it. I believe you're still under oath, but Ms. Dombrowski, would you raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear the testimony you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
May I proceed, Madam Chair? Okay.
Sorry, yes.
Ms. Dombrowski, apologize. Could you please remind the board of your name and where you work and your occupation?
Sure. Full name is Paula Joy Dombrowski. I'm a licensed structural engineer. I currently work for Julie Cromwell and Associates.
Thank you. Just have some questions here related to what you heard. You were present throughout this hearing, is that correct?
Correct.
And you were present for Monday's hearing where Mr. Randy Wilson testified on behalf of the property owner. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Can you tell us what a gravity load is?
Sure. Sure. So we have a couple forms of gravity loads. Those are usually forces in the vertical direction. So that would mainly be our dead and live loads that our buildings encounter. Dead load meaning the weight of materials, so like the structure itself, the flooring, that kind of thing. And then live loads being the people load, the furniture load, things that are movable. And then we also have what I would call what is snow load. So snow load is considered a gravity type force, vertical direction that's on a building periodically.
Can you tell us about the condition of the layers of brick behind the stone veneer and the girder on which that brick rests, please?
The brick appears to be in very good condition.
Excuse me, I was muted, I apologize. Would you please let me know which girder you're asking about? Mr. Studer, you said behind the girder. I just want to know which one.
I think the question was, can you tell us about the condition of the layers of brick behind the stone veneer? And then the condition of the girders, I guess I could ask, on which that brick rests.
Okay, so there is brick above all girders, and there is brick behind all but a triangular piece of stone veneer. And from what we can tell from the inside, the brick appears to be in very good condition. We do not have visible access at the moment to the outside face of the multi-white brick wall, but we do know that there are more than 2 layers of brick above the girder based on dimensions, and below the girder there are 2 layers of brick above low roofs. Once we get below roofs, then we have 3 layers of whites of brick. The girders, so you asked me also about the condition of the girder. Again, inside the bell tower, we can tell that the girder is in great condition. It really is. I mean, there's some surface rust, but overall, it's in really good condition. The visible part of the outside of the girder, which is the east face, on my first site visit was not visible. There was stone in front of the flanges, or in between the flanges in front of the outside web. But you could tell that there was something going on at the corner. You could see delaminations because dimensionally the flange sticks out to the outer edge of the outside of the stone. So likely it was collecting some water. On subsequent visits, the stone had been removed, and it was. I mean, that is something that I, in general, agree with Randy. The girder needs to be repaired and put back to the original construction. The steel has delaminated, at least in the small portion that is open today. I would caution that because the stone is no longer wedged between the flanges, we might actually be making the condition worse at the moment. The stone may have been helping keep it stable. So I would recommend that something be shored between those flanges temporarily until remediation can be performed.
Mr. Studer, I'd like to interject just a second here.
Please.
Because it seems like these questions that you're working on with Ms. Dombrowski are very general as opposed to like specific points. And I guess I would like to caution us against getting back into that dueling engineers conversation, because it's clear these 2 engineers have very different opinions of the situation. that's always going to happen. There's been nothing that's been presented to say that to refute the professionalism or the of either of these engineers. So I just don't see where this portion of the questioning is going, and you can continue, but I don't want to get back into like opening that all up again. Quite frankly, you know, the THP report is, they're providing a service and they've stamped it. And while I absolutely respect and appreciate Ms. Dombrowski's professional opinion, she's not in the same role that THP is, and they have provided an official report and stamped that and as well. So I just wanted to get that out there so we don't get back into the dueling engineers.
Understood. I'd like to ask her some questions to just address specifically testimony of Mr. Wilson, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. But if
Okay.
it goes too broad, I think we might have to rein it in.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Ms. Dombrowski, Mr. Wilson suggested during his testimony that a girder might collapse at any moment. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that Mr. Wilson should have, after the destructive testing that they did, which they removed the stone surface, should have realized that when the angle had been deteriorated such as it was, that he needed to put something back in there to make it stable. So I do believe that in its condition, as I last saw it, it's in a vulnerable position and should be shored up. Like I said, there's brick below the bottom flange of the girder. They could fill that with the stone again or any type of masonry until repairs could be made.
Thank you. Now, in his testimony, Mr. Wilson indicated that he believes the Ohio Building Code is insufficient and that a responsible engineer must go above and beyond the Ohio Building Code. Do you consider the Ohio Building Code a minimum standard for design?
For structural engineers, it is the minimum requirement, but it is not minimum forces that are developed in the building code. I think that it's very misleading to consider that minimum standards. The forces that are required by the building code have a long history. So for instance, surveys have been done on the live loads in the late 70s, early 80s, where they surveyed existing buildings for live loads and determined what was actually going on in office spaces and classroom spaces. And much of that data is found in the commentary of the building code. I'm going to put it in front of me just so I don't quote it incorrectly. And actually in the commentary, it says, it is well known that floor loads measured in a live load survey usually are well below present design values. And for instance, office buildings, being surveyed and them coming up with, 30 to 40 pounds per square foot of load. And our current load today is 50 pounds per square foot. Same as.
May I raise the issue again? This is not rebuttal. This is rebutting nothing.
I would agree. I don't see where the specific or narrow rebuttal of something specific from earlier testimony.
And this goes directly to Mr. Wilson's testimony that you must go above and beyond the OBC and that it's a minimum standard.
And what I've heard so far is that, yes, there's some agreement there that it is a minimum standard and you might have to go above and beyond it. Is that not?
Ms. Dombrowski, is that what you testified to?
No, what I'm saying is that it's based on maximum forces. So it's based on a history of weather data, of surveys of academia and researchers who do this, and experts, for instance, the seismic forces. There's a reason that we do not have to do a seismic upgrade on this building. And it's important to note that most structural engineers here in the Midwest are not experts in seismic design. We get those experts from the West Coast where there are actual earthquakes that cause damage. A building that's designed, a similar building designed in two different areas, high seismic versus low seismic, those are two different structures that come out of our design tools. And Mr. Wilson's insistence that it needs to have a seismic upgrade is unnecessary. We do not have the same level of risk for a seismic force event that would cause building damage. There are documents from the USGS, the US Geological surveys that have been done. We know in our area, those seismic events don't happen here. We have had no deaths from a seismic event.
Well, I have a question regarding this. You said there's studies that show in office buildings that the actual loads are 30 and 40 pounds or 30 pounds per square foot. Regardless of that, the design value you would use to design that structural system is the code minimum, which is 50.
For a new building, yes.
Correct. So I think we are matching different statements and ideas here. It's the statement that we heard previously was that the building codes are minimum values. And I think we're in agreement that that is true. I understand what you're saying about the seismic loads, but actually the report, Mr. Wilson's report doesn't say it needs seismic upgrades. So that's what I'm trying to figure out, what the rebuttal, what your I guess feeling was said that needs to be restated.
I'm not sure if I'm supposed to respond or not, Sean. I was going to say, I would like to try to answer that for you.
Please.
Okay, so again, it's a question of cost. So Randy has maintained that a seismic upgrade is absolutely required. As I understand it, the pastor testified saying that if this seismic upgrade wasn't done, he was going to resign. It is not required. And it is based on people who have studied this and put this information together in the building code. They have given us a recipe for us to follow. And when we follow that, the criteria based on the First Lutheran Church building itself and the way it is put together, the location, all of that matters. And the recipe tells us a seismic upgrade is not required. There are no signs of distress in the lateral force resisting system that exists today. And so when we come back to OTR Adopt offering to help stabilize the structure and remove the order that the city has put in place, it comes into play with the cost, because there is not a reason to do the seismic upgrade.
Okay,
That
so
is the portion we disagree on as engineers.
I'd just like to direct the board to OTR Exhibit 11. That's the THB report from January 22nd, 2021, where page 4, the report says THP recommended using the elevator structure to stabilize the upper bell tower for seismic load requirements. Seismic has been discussed by the property owner party.
Okay, I mean, I guess I would take it to be that the survey that we have dated, OTR Exhibit 10 is what it's marked from September 16th, 2020. Is that a different report than the one you were referencing? I thought you called it a different exhibit number.
Yes, it's a different report. There are two THP reports. Exhibit 11, OTR 11 is January 22nd, 2021.
I'm sorry, the report the chair was referring to, would you say that again, please?
I'm referring to THP report September 16th, 2020.
Thank you.
Yes, that's exhibit OTR 10.
Yes. Let me get the other one in front of me, sorry. I guess regardless of the specific values or wording in the report, an owner of a property, of a historic property or non-historic property, if they chose to, could choose to make seismic improvements, even though it's not required by the building code because of the nature or the age of the structure. Is that correct, Ms. Dombrowski?
That is true, but it's also not a reason to tear a building down because of cost.
Precisely, Madam Chair. This is about an emergency demolition. Anybody could do any type of improvements to a building, but this is about whether it has to be done. Otherwise, it needs to be torn down. That's what we're talking about here. So, yeah, you could do anything you want to the building, but we're not talking about going above and beyond. We're talking about the bare minimum necessary to keep this historic structure standing.
And the stabilization is based on the 4 or 5 items that both Randy and I have identified as being part of the I'll call it gravity load concerns. And anything above and beyond that is an option to upgrade and could be done at a later time.
Agreed, but this is a private property. Is that correct? I mean, it's a privately owned property in a historic district. And as such, the city has the right to restrict what you can do with that property or not. And we're all, if any of us bought a historic property or in a historic recognized neighborhood, street, or whatever district, we'd be subject to the city saying whether we could or couldn't turn it down. So tear something down. So in this instance, regardless of the differing opinions on the structure, are you contending that the city didn't have the right? I guess the city didn't have the right to say that it was a hazard and it should be torn down.
The city did have the right to say that it was a hazard. I think the misconception is whether or not it needs to be demolished and it can be repaired.
Yeah, there are multiple elements at play here, whether it's a serious hazard, whether it's an urgent situation that needs to be rectified immediately, and whether it's necessary to demolish it. Those are the 3 things that we need to decide in order for the city to be justified in its order.
Agreed.
And we'll hit that on our a closing statement too. We'll summarize. We'll try to package all this together, at least from our perspective, so that'll hopefully help. Because I know there's just a ton of details and information here to keep track of.
Madam Chair, can I ask a question really quick? I know you told me to wait, but
No, please do. I think we need to get all of our questions out because
I just think this is the right time to ask this question. And it actually goes to the city administration. My understanding from the record was that, and I want to ask if this is correct, that there was some sort of clarification issued by Mr. Dahlberg that indicated that the demolition order was not related to the seismic levels. And I'm not saying this exactly the right way, but that whether or not, or put it in other words, that in order for you did not have, I think he clarified that that the bell tower did not need to reach the seismic levels in order for the order to be lifted. So that, to me, that means whether the building meets the seismic, a disagreement about whether the seismic is needed or not is not really relevant, because it's not relevant to, it's not part of the calculation of the, or it's not part of the reasoning and justification for the demolition order that is what is being appealed. But I want to make sure I'm correct in that.
Madam Chair, if I could answer that question. So
yes, please. Sorry.
I think let's put it in a little bit of context, if you don't mind. The church sent me copies of reports by both engineers Wilson and Dombrowski, and asked for my opinion of those reports. I responded back to that in a letter to the church, in which I identified that both engineering firms are in good standing, nothing against either engineering firm, but from a purely bare minimum, what the code requires, there is not an obligation to upgrade the building's seismic resistance capabilities. So while anybody can design something to a higher standard than the building code, seismic upgrades for an existing building that hasn't suffered damage from an earthquake event is not required by the building code. So that's been our position all along, that for this, if either the demolition needs to take place or stabilization needs to take place, but the stabilization to meet minimum code requirements does not require a seismic upgrade.
And so, thank you. And so just one follow-up. So then to meet the building code, it does not require a seismic upgrade. To meet I hope this is not too much of a hypothetical, but could the demolition order be lifted if the other elements outlined in the is it also true that meeting seismic load levels is not required for the demolition order to be lifted?
Madam Chair, the answer to that is quite simply, seismic doesn't need to be upgraded to lift the order. All we really need is coming from ownership of a plan of how to stabilize this building. And that stabilization plan does not need to take into account current seismic requirements for new construction. Merely, how are you going to bring the building's functional capabilities back to how it was originally built and originally approved?
Okay, thank you. I'll just say real quick, and then I'll yield it back to the appellants. But to me, the debate about whether seismic is or isn't required is not really relevant at all to this discussion. I mean, because the discussion is whether the order was justified or not. That's what we're being asked to hear, as I understand it. And I think, Sean, you'll lay out the arguments. But as I understand the basics of what we're being asked to do, and the appellant is to say that this was not, that Mr. Dahlberg's decision was wrong. And if his decision is not based on seismic load levels, then I think that makes that, to me, irrelevant. So with that, I'll yield back.
Mr. Suter, so you can continue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In his testimony, Mr. Wilson testified that the bell tower has a latent defect. He mentioned this a number of times. That there are only 2 walls and 1 small post to take the bell tower to the ground. He even showed a paper model that I suppose he made. Is this correct?
He's missing a few other parts and pieces that make it work. Number one, I would say that, again, we have one structure. The bell tower doesn't exist without the sanctuary, and the sanctuary doesn't exist without the bell tower. They are one. We have documentation, and I believe Mr. Wilson testified as such as well. The trusses that support the sanctuary ceiling are supported by the columns, the cast columns of the bell tower. They are one structure. The dome roof of the main sanctuary, the wood rafters, sit on the brick wall that is supported by the steel girder of the bell tower. You don't get to, in my opinion, you do not get to separate those 2 structures out. They are one structure. This morning, I spent some time with my team, and we did some very high-level calcs. And I don't know if it's appropriate to go into 2 minutes of detail with those calcs. But we took Randy's, Mr. Wilson's.
I pose an objection. The chair has been very clear that this rebuttal is not to include new evidence. Those were the words out of the chair's mouth. Not to include new evidence. This was not addressed. These calculations were not addressed in the prior presentation by OTR. In
So
fact,
the admonition was new evidence that does not directly refute or rebut evidence that was introduced by the appellant or by the church, to be clear.
I heard it differently.
So I believe Mr. Wilson.
May I have a ruling by the chair, please? I think this is new evidence. And frankly, it's unfair to come in and present your case doing absolutely no calculations and not give us an opportunity to respond to the calculations. And then now in the so-called rebuttal phase, bring out brand new evidence that we're not going to be permitted to respond to. The new evidence being calculations.
So hold on. We have an objection on the floor. Again, for the record, you will have an opportunity to cross-examine the witness. The appellant has the burden here. That's why they get a rebuttal, and you don't get to put on additional witnesses after the rebuttal. Sean, do you have a response to the objection that's on the floor?
That would be my response. Mr. Shaley has the right to test the veracity and credibility of whatever Ms. Dombrowski is going to present on cross-examination.
Ms. Chair, may Ms. Dombrowski continue?
Madam Chair,
I don't think I'm not sure it's appropriate to, I'm hearing back of the napkin calculations type of things, and I'm not trying to disrespect at all, because I know engineers are much more precise than that. But I don't know that it's appropriate to introduce this new information at this point, and not in a official way with these numbers. So I would uphold the objection.
So what's your conclusion on Ms. Dombrowski, the latent defect? The alleged latent defect?
So what would be interesting is that latent defect, if one truly believes in that latent defect, which I do not. And again, the calculations that I did this morning were just to support what my initial findings were. However, even demolishing the top of the bell tower, you still have a latent defect. You don't get out of that. If you are taking the tower down just above the girder, you still have the latent defect, and you don't get to choose what height the latent defect goes away. It's still there. And as I mentioned, the sanctuary structure doesn't exist without the bell tower structure. They are one, and they lean on each other and they support each other.
Let's talk about 1212 race real quick. There was testimony in the hearing that it was impossible to repair the bell tower without demolishing, or at least partially demolishing 1212 Race Street. Is that correct?
I disagree with that. I think that's very short-sighted. We repair buildings all the time without removing adjacent structures. It is more difficult, more painstaking, more labor intensive, but we do it all the time. The back courtyard of 1212 is the perfect place for a laydown area. I know there's an alleyway behind 1212 and 1208. There may be a wall. I'm certain there's a wall between the courtyard and that alley. That wall may have to be removed and rebuilt for access. As we saw even in the photos that Mr. Wilson was presenting on Monday, there's already material stored on 1212 roof, on the roof of 1212. There's materials stored on the lower roof of 1208. We, again, is that roof framing shored up? I don't know that for a fact today, but we can shore existing roofs to carry loads down to the ground while work is being done. We can needle beam below the girder as appropriate and shore on the inside of the tower. Again, not always easy, but doable. These are the situations that we are challenged with as structural engineers every day. So I don't understand, personally, I don't understand the reason for the demolition of 1212 to fix 1208.
Thank you, Mr. Dombrowski. In your professional opinion, as a professional structural engineer, based on everything you've heard, all the testimony, everything you've read, the reports and the record and everything you've seen personally relative to the bell tower, is this an emergency?
Objection.
No.
Can you tell me what this is?
Is the condition of the bell tower in its current condition an emergency condition?
No.
Okay.
We have time to make the repairs and we should be repairing this historic structure.
That's all I have for you. Thank you, Ms. Dombrowski. Appreciate it.
Ross?
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question before Ms. Dombrowski goes away, or to Mr. Studer and the whole team?
Yes.
So in your opinion, it's not an emergency. If the structure did fall in part or in total while this process is going on, Ms. Dombrowski or Julie Cromwell Associates wouldn't bear any liability. Is that correct? And neither would OTR Adopt or anyone that's representing that, anyone on the appellant side. Is that accurate?
Mr. Klingler through OTR Adopt has offered to the property owner to assume any liability.
That's not wholly accurate. He's agreed to assume liability only up to when the building has the repairs that Ms. Dombrowski suggests. His email does not assume liability thereafter. So for the next 3 or 4 years, while the fundraising is purportedly going to go on and the building is, in our view, unsafe, Mr. Klingler's email does not provide any indemnity for the owner. It's a
that's because
promise.
if the repairs are made, according to Ms. Dombrowski or according to Mr. Wilson, the repairs that have been proposed, according to Mr. Dahlberg, either set of repairs would shore up the building, stabilize the building, and allow it to continue on safely.
In our view, it would not handle the lateral loads. That's the biggest problem here, as you know. And the offer is to cut off the indemnification after Dombrowski's repairs are made. And that is not even close to sufficient because the large portion of the problem are the lateral load issues.
Okay, but my question is actually though for the appellant side, and it is outside of any other agreement, like formal agreement being made, the sole liability lies on the building owner, the property owner.
Well, that's always the case, yes.
Yes, okay,
But there's
Thank
no
you.
emergency and there's nothing to be liable for. So,
thank you.
We ready for cross?
I am if you guys are.
Okay.
This is Fritz Shadley on behalf of First Lutheran. I wanted to just clear up one thing. If you look at Exhibit 12, which is Mr. Wilson's September 29, 2021 report, this is Exhibit 12 marked by the appellant OTR. Mr. Wilson says the following. Point 6 at the bottom. The June 30, 2021 JCA report relies on Chapter 34 of the OBC as justification for the removal of proposed seismic bracing from the project. This can be ostensibly justified by a strict reading of Chapter 34. So to your point, he does not require seismic upgrade. Would you agree with me on that, Ms. Dombrowski? This ostensibly can be justified from a strict reading of Chapter 34.
Regardless of the strict reading or not, agreed, you don't need the seismic upgrade, but I don't believe that's what he testified to on Monday.
Well, the board heard him. I disagree with your characterization. Let's move on. He did say there needed to be lateral load supports, and we'll get into that. You would agree with me that the structure needs to have the structure meaning the bell tower, I'm sorry, needs to have an adequate system to resist lateral loads, and that system needs to be fully connected to ground.
And it is.
You would agree with me, would you not?
Agreed, and it currently is.
And you have identified the basis of your belief that the resistance to the lateral loads is sufficient and is connected to ground. The basis of that belief is your presumptions that portions of the structure of the church are attached to the bell tower at the first floor, the second floor, and the gallery, correct?
Correct. And I don't think they are presumptions, but
But you testified that you believe those connections to be there. You don't know the strength of those connections, and you don't, in fact, know whether they are there. In fact, in your testimony, you said, I wish I could go back into the structure to see those connections. But your testimony was, as of the date of your testimony, you did not know whether the connections were there. You presumed they were, correct? That's what you said.
I would like to go back in and open it up for Mr. Wilson's sake so that I could educate him.
You don't know whether those connections are there, Mr. Dombrowski, do you? I mean, I can read the transcript to you. I can show you what you said. You said, I don't know, I presume, correct?
There has to be connections there. It's working.
You don't know whether there are connections there to provide, know for a fact whether there are connections that provide any resistance to the lateral loads, right?
The building is in its third phase of a 50-year cycle, which is what most of our building code required loads are based on today. It's in its third phase of a 50-year cycle and is showing no sign of distress laterally.
You don't know for a fact. Please answer the question. You are an engineer. You've signed and sealed a report. You want the citizens of Cincinnati to rely on your report for their safety. And you don't know for a fact whether there's one connection that will handle or resist the lateral load. Am I correct? You don't know that for a fact.
I do know a lot about historic buildings
You
and
don't
how they
know-
operate. And I also know that I am probably the only one who has cut a hole or been there and witnessed cutting a hole in the plaster. So in terms of any type of forensic investigation, I feel I have done far more than what Mr. Wilson has.
I'm glad that you feel that way, and you have failed to answer the question, which itself is rather telling. I'm sure the board observes it. I'm going to ask it a third time, please. You don't know for a fact whether there is any connection between the tower and the structure of the church that will provide resistance to lateral loads, correct?
I disagree with that statement.
Well, what are the facts? Have you seen them? Have you seen the connections? Because you testified on Monday, you have not seen the connections.
I have seen a,
I was gonna say, I feel that you've answered the question, Ms.
Thank you.
Dombrowski. And I think, Mr. Shaley, if you could move to your next question.
It's also accurate, is it not, that you've done no calculations to determine the degree to which those connections that you are asserting between the bell tower and the church, the degree to which those connections provide lateral resistance to lateral forces? You have done no calculations in that regard, correct?
I have done some calculations, and to validate what my theory was on how the building was behaving. And honestly, in a lot of historic buildings, we don't have positive connections because the weight of the building provides its own connection through friction. So again, though someone might seem like they are very basic calculations, when you actually take Mr. Wilson's 650,000 pounds or 630,000 pound weight above and convert that to a base shear, and if I assume that his weight is correct and move forward with that, and he has in his report an 80,000 pound base shear load at the top of the girder, which I can validate if the 600,000 pound weight is correct, and we reduce that for a 75% full seismic force to 60,000 pounds, which is also a factored load, and we convert that to a service load condition, I end up with 42,000 pounds.
Did I ask you this question, and did you answer it this way? For page 79 and 80 of the prior transcript, question: for the south wall, what do you postulate as the complete load path going to the ground? Answer: there's a steel frame and it's interconnected with the sanctuary structure. Question: what is the capacity of that steel frame? Answer: I have not done that calculation. My question is, how much lateral force resistance is provided by what you describe as a steel structure connected to the south wall? Do you know that? Answer: I have not done those calculations. Is those correct questions and answers? Did I read them correctly in your testimony Monday?
They are, but an engineer who does this type of work would understand that I can also use a 3-sided box.
Let me
And
ask,
doing those calculations, I've got the existing brick to work.
brick, which is brittle, as Mr. Wilson testified.
But it also has a giant mass sitting right on top of it.
I understand that. Were you asked these questions, and did you give these answers, please? When you say the west wall is connected to the sanctuary structure, how did you understand it to be connected? Your answer was at the roof, the second floor, and the first floor. And my question: and are the connections what are the connections and how strong are they? Answer: I would love to know that.
Mhm.
I'd love to open it up and find out. Question: you don't know? You don't know if it's even really connected at the second floor because you haven't seen it? And by it, I mean the west wall. Is it really connected to the sanctuary structure on the second floor? You don't know that for a fact, and your answer was, it's highly likely, but I have not seen it with my own eyes. Do you recall giving those answers to those questions?
I have not seen those connections with my own eyes, but just as my conversation with Mr. Wilson and our understanding of what is supporting the west wall, because we know the west wall disappears somewhere below the gallery level, correct? And when I asked Mr. Wilson the question, what he presumed was supporting the west wall, and he also made a similar statement
You
that
made-
something had to be
gravity.
supporting the west wall.
This was gravity support, not lateral support.
Correct, absolutely, which
there's
is
gravity.
just as important.
Of course, there's gravity support, but you don't know if there's anything that connects. You don't know for a fact, as it relates to the west wall, whether there's any connection that resists the lateral load, right? I mean, that's what you said. I read it to you.
Because there's no sign of distress in that zone, there has to be a connection that's working, and it must be working well.
What's the strength of that connection, man?
I don't know. I don't believe
okay.
Mr. Wilson knows either, though.
Yeah, and how much lateral load will that connection provide? What resistance to the lateral load? You don't know that either, do you?
I don't.
She
Okay.
has already answered the question. I'd like to again move out of the dueling engineers conversation.
Mr. Tolshinsky, were you trying to say something there? If so, we couldn't hear you. Yeah, we cannot hear you. Still nothing.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
we'll
we
go with
can.
that then. All right.
Okay, great.
I just wanted to say, I believe Mr. Dahlberg already said that this order pertains to the gravity load, and discussion of the lateral load seems off topic at this point.
What I think I've tried to say is upgrading the building, upgrading the bell tower to seismic criteria is not necessary by the minimum standard of the building code. Therefore, it's not part of the orders that we issued. What we are looking for, if indeed stabilization would take place, what we are looking for is returning the functionality of the bell tower to its original condition. So that means, yes, being able to get loads down to foundation, but we have to honor the fact that the building was approved, it was built, and it's existed for well over 100 years. So when we're talking about necessary stabilization, we aren't trying to reinvent the building to make it into a 2021 building. What we are saying is you've got to restore it back to what it was originally, and that's how it was allowed to function. Hope that helps.
May I ask a question of Mr. Dahlberg, just on that narrow statement he asserted? The chair I'm asking, not you, Mr. Sturkey.
Yes.
You have to do that, Mr. Dahlberg, but at the same time, you have to make sure the building is safe. That's what Chapter 34 tells us, correct?
It does.
Okay.
But the underlying principle is that we honor the approval when a building was built.
I understand that. Thank you.
And people need to maintain their buildings in accordance with that approval. And as long as they do that, we are supposed to honor that original approval. That's a basic tenet of the building code.
But when the building owner does that, he or she has to do it so the building is in fact safe. Right? As it exists today, whatever you're going to do to it, it has to be safe. That's what 34 tells us, Chapter 34. I'll read it to you if you'd like.
You don't need to do that, sir.
Do you agree with me, please?
Yes, the term safe exists in Chapter 34. It is not a defined term. And what I am saying is the basic principle underlying everything we do in the building code is once something is approved and is built in accordance with its approval, we're supposed to honor that approval as long as the use of the building doesn't change and as long as the property owner maintains the building in accordance with that original approval.
Who was it that approved this building when it was initially built in the late 1800s?
In the city of Cincinnati, we have had building codes way before this building was built.
Let me ask Ms. Dombrowski a question, please. This relates not to the connection between the structure and the bell tower. Mr. Dahlberg testified to this, and I want to ask you if you agree or disagree. Question. This was in the testimony, I'm sorry, the testimony on Monday that we both, Sean and I believe, both got a rough transcript of. Question. And again, your position is whether the bell tower is demoed or restored, repair the building, a portion of the building at 1212 has to come down consistent with your order on 1212, correct? Answer, correct. So Ms. Dombrowski, in this circumstance, you happen to disagree with Mr. Dahlberg, correct?
I do.
Do you understand that Mr. Dahlberg in his order indicated that one of the reasons 1212 had to come down was for the safety of the workers? Do you understand that?
I understand that that's his reasoning, but I disagree with that.
It's a good reason, isn't it? For the safety of the workers important, is it not, Ms. Dombrowski?
I do, and I work with a lot of contractors and help them with their means and methods. I can't think of a reason to demolish 1212 for the sake of safety of workers. I think it just makes it easier to do the demolition that they're proposing.
And to do otherwise, to try to do the demolition or the repair without removing a portion of 1212, you said would be harder, and with that likely more expensive, correct?
It could be more expensive. I believe our bids that OTR Adopt has acquired do not involve the demolition of 1212 for the stabilization, the restabilization of the bell tower.
Okay. I'd like to ask you some questions on the girder and the angle iron. Do you have your report Exhibit 6 before you? OTR Exhibit 6?
Which date of the report?
That is June 30, please.
Yes.
Referring to the photo on page 3, photo of the girder, please.
Yes.
What is that? You see the girder in the photo, I'm sure. There's a white, sort of appears to be a white plastic sheet. Can you tell me what that is?
Flashing
Okay. And
that I
what-
believe that is probably been put there temporarily.
what-
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know why it was put there. I don't know if it was put there after the stone was removed or
Understood. What is the material that is from the middle of the page to middle of the picture to the right of the picture going up in the frame? What is all that grayish brown material?
that is the steel that's degrading. We all agree with that.
The steel, that could be the angle iron that's missing, correct?
Agreed.
Okay.
We don't disagree.
Okay. The degree to which a girder maintains its strength depends in some measure on the degree to which the girder angle maintains its integrity, correct?
Correct. It needs repaired.
And so.
But
well,
it can also be shored to prevent a failure if one recognizes the fact that the angle is gone.
okay, I understand. But in this case, would you agree with me the angle's gone?
In that photo, yes.
Okay, so let's go about this, please, sequentially. The degree to which the ability of the girder, the strength of the girder is diminished depends upon the degree to which the angle is gone, not functioning, right?
Correct. In the limited area that we have the ability to see, the degradation is significant and needs to be repaired. A structural engineer on site should be able to recognize that and say, we need to do something about this.
And did you determine what portion of the angle iron, is that the right phrase? I'm sorry. Should I say angle or angle iron?
Likely it's a piece of cast steel.
Okay, angle. We'll call it angle then. I apologize. Did you determine for this girder in this paragraph, this is this picture, I'm sorry, the top picture on page 9 of OTR Exhibit 6, did you determine the percentage of that angle which had degraded and was no longer performing its function?
No,
And
there
therefore,
would be no reason to do that because it needs to be repaired.
and therefore you do not know the degree to which the original strength of the girder has been diminished because you did not determine the degree to which the angle has deteriorated, correct?
No, but you also want to recognize this is the east wall, the one that does go to the foundation. So it would be very easy to post in between or to fill it with masonry or to grout it solid so that a failure doesn't happen.
Yeah, but we're talking about your opinion, whether it's an emergency or not. And I'm trying to determine, did you make an evaluation of the degree to which the strength of the girder, the east girder, was diminished?
No,
So the strength of this girder could be 90% less than it was when it was first put in place, correct? You don't know.
I don't know the answer to that.
And with that, there is some risk with a girder whose ability to resist a gravity load is diminished by 90%. There is some risk that the girder could fail and the building could topple. You would agree with me there?
And yet it's been sitting like this for how many months instead of someone doing something about it. And it's a very easy fix. It's a manual labor fix of carrying some masonry up to the low roof of the sanctuary and blocking between the flanges to prevent any failures, localized failures.
Would you answer the question, please? You would agree with me that there is some risk that if in fact the east girder's strength is diminished by 90%, there is some risk that the building could fail, the girder could fail, and the building could topple, right?
There is some risk, and the people who have control over that risk have not done anything about it.
Okay, and you don't know the degree to which that risk is an emergent or immediate risk because you have not determined whether the diminishment of the strength of the girder is 90% or 50% or 10%. You don't know the degree because you haven't made the calculation.
We shouldn't have to, because a logical person would say, let's block this up and prevent the emergency, prevent the failure.
Answer my question. You've said to us there is a risk of failure and the building would topple if the girder failed. And my question to
I
you,
didn't say the building would topple if the girder failed. I have seen,
the building will topple if the girder fails, correct?
I have not said that.
Well, you agree with it, I would imagine.
I
If the girder
I don't agree with that.
If this girder, the east girder, buckles and fails, are you saying the tower is going to stay up?
You will have a localized failure. I don't believe the tower is going to fall down.
Based on what?
Because you have an entire wall below it right now. And again, recognize the fact that someone can go in and put some blocks in there to shore it up, and it'd probably take less than 6 hours to do it. We should be doing something about that instead of arguing about it.
And why should we be doing something about that? Because there's a risk, isn't there?
Well, and I do believe it's about the maintenance of the property. And you've had structural engineers on site that have recognized it.
Because
Two structural engineers that have recognized it.
because we should be doing something about that. The reason we should be doing something about that is because there's a risk. right?
There's a risk, but you're wanting to tear the building down instead of repairing it.
I'm not wanting to tear the building down at all. I'm trying to figure out with you, did you determine in any way the degree of the risk? And because you didn't determine the degree of the angle deterioration and therefore didn't determine the degree to which the girder is compromised, I think it's clear you didn't determine the amount of the risk of the girder failing, right?
I did not run calculations, but it's a very simple fix.
Okay, thank you. Now, how about the other girders? This picture here is a girder on the east wall. There are girders that are on the exterior or adjacent to the exterior on both the north and the south walls, correct?
Mhm. Yes, sorry.
That's okay. And the reason this girder is deteriorated and the angle is missing, by this I mean the east girder, is because water got in through the brick or the stone facade and water caused the deterioration, right?
That is correct.
And the proximity of those other girders, you would expect the proximity to the outside, the proximity to the facade of those other two girders, north and south, is the same as the proximity of this girder, the east girder, right?
It is correct, and it is likely that we have similar damage to these girders. Right now, they are blocked. We don't know. They are blocked with the stone masonry. We do not know the damage. It is important that we repair it.
Excuse me. You're
Mr.
saying-
Shadley, I'd like to ask that we narrow this to direct rebuttal of things, not new questions. Isn't
Okay.
that
I've got one more question on this subject matter and I'll move on.
okay?
The other two girders, I think you said, likely have similar deterioration.
Yeah, we do not know
Did
to
you,
what degree.
did you look at them or determine in any way the degree that they're deteriorated before you provided your opinion that this building is safe? Did you look?
Again, from a
This has been
logical,
asked and answered.
And we haven't talked about the other two girders, but for these two questions, the prior one and this one. That is
Maybe
not.
just ask a
There's
question about-
There's an objection that this has been asked and answered, Ms. Chair. Would you like to sustain or overrule that objection? And you're muted.
Sustain.
All right, next question.
Do you have any idea the degree to which the other two girders, north and south, have rusted and their strength is diminished? Any idea?
I do not.
And if they are, that brings risk to the building, correct?
Currently, the flanges are blocked.
If they are deteriorated, they meaning the north and south girders, that brings risk to the building, correct?
There is currently that risk is undeterminable at the moment.
And the risk is a risk of collapse.
We need to see what's going on. And again, I would assume that the engineer hired by the property owner would want to know that as well.
I'd like an answer, please, to my question. I'd like to be able to move on. The risks that you indicate exist,
Objection, this has been asked and answered.
the risk that you indicate exists.
There's an objection. Mr. Shadley, would you like to respond?
She clearly hasn't answered the question. I asked her, is the risk that she has admitted to as it relates to the other two girders, is it a risk that could cause the building to collapse? That's all I want to know.
I believe she did answer it, and I think the response was that these conditions aren't visible, and so that can't be determined, which to me means that she can't assess that risk.
That's fine. Then how could you
Is that accurate, Ms. Dombrowski?
That is correct.
And because
Okay,
And right now they are intact, which would indicate that they are still performing.
of course they're still performing, but if you can't determine the risk, then how can you provide an opinion that the building is safe? That's That just blows my mind, frankly. If you can't not determine the risk, how do you stamp a report that says to the community the building is safe?
I am saying that the building is safe to proceed with repairs. I am still saying that we need to have repairs made before you would allow occupants back in. There is time to repair this building. The time is now.
May I ask the court reporter, please, to read that answer back?
I am saying that the building is safe to proceed with repairs. I am still saying that we need to have repairs made before you would allow occupants back in. There is time to repair this building. The time is now.
Can you read the first phrase? Please, just the first sentence or two again? I thought that was different than I heard.
I am saying that the building is safe to proceed with repairs. I am still saying that we need to have repairs made before you would allow occupants back in.
And my question was neither of those. So I'm going to restate it or say it again. If you cannot determine the risk of the girders failing, how can you determine and hold an opinion that the building today is safe?
Based on its current performance. But we know that repairs need to be made.
What does that mean based on its current? You mean because it's still standing? You're basing your opinion it's safe because it's still standing. That what you mean by based on its current performance? Is that what you mean, please?
Oftentimes there are signs of distress in buildings that are not visible. These signs of distress are now opened up and visible. We agree that repairs need to be made to this building. We agree that they should be done promptly.
But you have said the building is safe, and how can you say it's safe when you can't determine the risk?
I said it was safe to proceed with repairs.
Oh, okay. Is the building safe? With these girders in the condition they are, is the building safe? It's not, is it? You don't know the degree to which the girders are diminished. How can you tell us that it's safe or not safe? It could be 10% of the strength of the girder left. You don't know. So how do you have an opinion it's safe, ma'am? Please.
I believe, based on my experience in this world of restoration of buildings, that we have time to make repairs to this building. And that's what we should be focusing on, not arguing.
Is the building safe as it exists today?
I think she has answered this question and we need to move on.
Please.
Would it be your view that the repairs that you're saying need to be made, would it be your view for purposes of the safety of the community that those repairs are made quickly?
Promptly, yes. We at Julia Cromwell and Associates, we've already started our repair drawings. We are about 75% done with the drawings. We probably have a few more details to get out there and some specifications to put together, and we'd be ready to issue them if someone would allow us to do that.
Would you agree with me that the repairs that need to be made to this building should be made immediately?
I believe they should be done as soon as feasibly possible.
I'd like to interject. I have a question for Ms. Dombrowski. The 75% CDs that you've done for repair work, who funded all of that?
OTR Adopt is who our contract is with.
Okay, thank you.
And when you say that the repairs should be done as soon as possible, why should they be done as soon as possible?
Because we are aware of the deficiencies that exist today.
And those deficiencies bring risk to the community, correct?
They
Jackson,
bring,
This has been asked and answered. It's also outside of rebuttal. I think we're going into general territory again here, and I'd ask for that question to be stricken and for the chair to ask Mr. Shaley to move on, please. Thank you.
Yes, I think the question has been asked and answered, and I would like to ask that we do move forward.
Okay, let's switch topics to the tension ring. Your pictures show, and I think you've testified and others have, that
Objection, Madam Chair. We didn't ask about the tension ring on our direct examination on rebuttal, so this is outside the scope of the rebuttal testimony.
well, she said the building was safe, and we know the tension ring has failed.
Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Shadley's testifying. She never said, he's mischaracterizing her testimony, one, and two, this is outside the scope of the rebuttal direct, so.
May I
outside the scope of
respond,
rebuttal.
please? May I respond? I didn't get
Yes.
the response out. Ms. Dombrowski has said the building is safe in her view. She has said it's not an emergency. And I think a reasonable rebuttal to that is to ask her a few questions on the tension ring, which she has said in the past have failed. The photographs show it is separated. And ask her the impact of that on the safety of this building.
Madam Chair, she's testified on direct examination about a month ago now about the tension ring, so I don't think we need to rehash this again.
Testified today, the building is safe. I want to rebut or challenge that as it relates to the tension ring, please. I'll limit my questions to a few minutes.
What I heard from Ms. Dombrowski is that it was safe to make repairs, but those repairs should be made before the building is reoccupied.
that's correct.
That isn't a flat, it's safe. So I don't believe that that's what she's saying, Mr. Shadley, and I think she's answered these questions, and I'm inclined to sustain the objection. Did I characterize your response correctly?
That's
Mr.
absolutely correct. Yes. Mhm.
Mr. Shadley, do you have more questions for Ms. Dombrowski?
I do, 1 minute, please.
Okay.
I just want to respond to the chair. She has indeed testified that it's safe to make repairs. She did not answer my question, is it safe? I think the record.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the rest.
She did not answer my question, is the building safe? She simply did not. The transcript will verify that. I'll move on.
If you'd like her to say it in her own words, is the building safe? She can give her response now, and then we'll be done with this line of questioning.
Is the building safe as it exists today? Is it safe for our community without repairs?
Repairs have to be done before you let occupants back in. It's no different than an active construction site. You have to finish what you've started. You have to finish the repairs. You have to finish the construction before you let occupants in.
And why is that? Is it because as of today, before the repairs are made, the building's not safe, right?
We've identified degradation in many locations that need to be repaired.
Doesn't answer my question, ma'am.
Objection.
You said I was
She's answered this question about 7 times now. I think we need to move on.
The chair said I was permitted to get the answer to the question, is the building safe today? And your response was, it's must be repaired to move people in. You did not answer, is it safe today? I just need an answer to that. I'm not saying it has to be yes or no, but is it safe today? Is it safe to stay in the condition it is?
We
So,
have
hold on, there's
the
an objection.
objection. I'd sustain the objection.
Any more questions, Mr. Shadley?
Yes, 1 minute, please. Let me look at my notes, please. Mr. Dahlberg testified in our Monday hearing that given the amount of degradation that he saw, wind knocking the building over is a very real possibility. Do you agree with that?
I disagree with that statement, but I also believe that was taken out of context. I don't think that is what Mr. Dahlberg meant. And maybe you could ask him what he meant by that.
Well, I'll read you the testimony.
I believe she answered the question. Is there any reason we need to read the testimony?
You said that it was taken out of context. I want to put it in context, please. I'd give you a page number, but I'm unable because the rough transcript we have does not provide it. The question is as follows, and then I'll recite his answer. Question: why is it that an event of Mother Nature, such as a wind load, might cause a problem to the degree that you issued the order? His answer is as follows: because we have components within the building that aren't functioning the way they were originally designed to function. So if you have a significant wind load, meaning pressure from a side, and the elements that would normally have resisted that are no longer properly connected, there is a potential of failure. Given the amount, and this refers to the part that I asked you about, quote, given the amount of degradation I saw in the building, I think that's a very real possibility, close quote. What about that context?
I'm not sure why you're asking me that
Well,
question.
You said the context was such that my question to you was inaccurate. That is what he testified to.
No, what I'm saying is, I think that he maybe meant something else, more of a localized failure where a stone might fall out. But
Okay.
again, with the wind forces that are imposed onto the tower, they are minor compared to the full weight of the structure. Likely the building never moves in a wind event.
Do you agree or not agree that a wind event could cause the building to fall over is a very real possibility? Do you agree with Art or not?
I don't believe the building's going to fall over. There could be a localized stone that comes out of the building.
Just Madam Chair, I know we're going to move on here. I just got to check my notes, please, and I think I'm finished. Okay, no more questions. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Suter, do you have any more witnesses on rebuttal?
Yes, we call Danny Klingler as a rebuttal witness.
Mr. Klinger, let's swear you in again. If you could raise your right hand, do you solemnly swear the testimony you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
JP Burley will do the direct examination of Mr. Klingler on rebuttal. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Klingler. Pastor Ferguson has spoken about the lack of support from the community or the inability of the community to fundraise to save the bell tower. So I think it would be helpful if you just walked us through the timeline of the community's efforts. He mentioned a meeting with you on November 29th, 2020. Who else from the community was in attendance at that meeting?
It was many people were in attendance. There was a large contingent who came out and expressed a lot of concern and desire to save the bell tower. So some of those folks would have been Jeannie Gallagher from Cincinnati Development Fund, Paul Muller from Cincinnati Preservation Association, Julie Fay from Iris Book Cafe, Marilyn Highland, who helped save the Esquire Theater and the 20th Century Theater. I'd have to look at my email, invite to see the others, but I would say there were between 8 and 10 folks on that call.
And Pastor Ferguson specifically mentioned Paul Muller in his previous testimony. Are you familiar with Paul Muller?
Yes, I am.
And what was Mr. Muller's involvement in the bell tower effort? Just to set that straight, please.
Mr. Mueller has been a strong proponent of preserving the bell tower from day one, a year ago until now. He's the director of Cincinnati Preservation Association. He absolutely believes that it can and should be saved. He absolutely believes demolition is the wrong option. And he absolutely believes that the fundamental problem here is that Mr. Wilson is the wrong engineer. Can I finish, please? That Mr. Wilson is the wrong engineer for this.
I object because he's restating what someone else believes. If we want to hear of that witness, we need to hear from that witness, not somebody who's characterizing what someone else says. That's not valid testimony.
May I respond, Madam Chair?
I know the answer.
Yes, please.
The only reason that Mr. Muller's name even brought up is because Mr. Shadley elicited testimony concerning Mr. Muller's opinions on Monday.
Right, and may I respond?
I think I would sustain the objection. He answered that Mr. Mueller is in favor of it. He doesn't need to go into the elaborating on Paul's feelings on things. So
Sure.
that's fine.
And we're happy to move on. Thank you.
Thank you.
And at that meeting, Mr. Klingler, the November 29th, 2020 meeting, what is the amount of funding that the church communicated to the community would be needed to be raised to save the bell tower?
Madam Chair, I have an objection to the question before it's answered, please. As one of the members of the board articulated, the issue before the board here, at least as framed by OTR, is whether there's an emergency. This has nothing to do with fundraising. I think it's wholly irrelevant, nor is it in rebuttal. We didn't raise fundraising.
She did.
Wholly irrelevant.
If we may, we made that objection at the beginning of this trial that fundraising and money raised was irrelevant, but then the church brought it up through the pastor and other testimonies. So I'm inclined to agree it's irrelevant, but my objection was overruled.
Mr. Shaley, I think your objection here is overruled.
Okay, thank you.
May I answer the question?
Yes, you may. The question was, what was that initial amount communicated that would be required to save the bell tower?
1.2 million.
Okay. And after that meeting, did Pastor Ferguson send the community an email saying they were going to save the bell tower?
Yes, that's correct.
And was that one of the reasons that OTR decided not to appeal at that time?
Yes, that's correct.
When did you become aware of the greater 3 million or higher figure desired by the church?
The end of March 2021.
And did you attempt to raise the full $3 million that the church requested?
Yes, even though we attempted to raise the full amount to satisfy everything, the full restoration, the seismic, like all of it, even though we didn't believe that was necessary, but we had no choice. So we had to do that.
Did the publicity around demolition make those efforts difficult?
Yeah, absolutely. We heard from many funders who said we'd love to help, but the publicity says they're tearing it down already. So it just made things that much more difficult in an 8-week time frame to do.
Can I ask a question here? How much money did you have in it? How much money did you fundraise that you had in hand?
Like cash? Like,
I'm not sure exactly what the definition is, honestly. I just
I think
like that you could turn over immediately to them to this effort.
Well, by the conclusion of the 8 weeks that we were given to raise 3 million over the summer, we had put together a funding package totaling 2.4 million. And we had been the spearhead of getting a second bid that brought the cost down to 2.5 million. approximately 2.5 million. So we put those two and two together, lower cost and a funding package. Now, that package was, some of it was like cash and pledges. Some of it was, we assembled financing like historic tax credits and things that would not be received immediately, but would have been received in plenty of time to do the full restoration and the seismic upgrade.
Can I ask, in a situation like this, I think earlier you had said that you didn't, you guys had never really gotten involved in a property like this where there's an active owner who's using the building for its intended purpose on a continued basis. Are there other legal agreements that go with accepting those types of funds?
I'm sorry, could you elaborate the question a little bit for me?
I guess if somebody gives you $2.4 million, what's the obligation in return? And what's the structure of that agreement that, I assume there's at minimum one binding agreement for you guys to donate that money and for the church to accept it. Is that right?
Yes, we offered to we offered to do it in whatever way the church was comfortable with. If they wanted Cincinnati Preservation Association, Cincinnati Development Fund, or OTR Adopt to be the financial intermediary that handled all of this. We just basically said, tell us how you want to do it and we'll do it.
And I had a follow-up question, and I don't mean to be disrespectful. I hope it's not taken that way, just because I am interested, and this is more like a fundamental, obviously you're doing what you're doing because you believe it's the right thing to do, and it's a good thing to do. But kind of beyond that, do you feel like a private owner, like somebody should be able to say you have to accept an exorbitant gift of a donation or something like that to a private owner and be beholden in some way or another to them?
No, I see what you're saying. I don't believe in forcing things on other people, but in this case, it's a community landmark that's protected by a historic district. And I felt that the whole thing was unjust, that we were in this process without a review from the Historic Conservation Board in a situation where I know in my heart this is not an emergency, because I deal with these every day, and every building that OTR Adopts ever dealt with that are far worse condition have never been declared emergency. I felt that there was an injustice going on, and I attempted to give the church every single thing they asked and wanted and to be kind all along. And when that was never accepted, it was like, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to let this be torn down for no good reason? So it wasn't until the church said, we're tearing it down and we're cutting off all communication, that we finally said we can either just lay down and let this be torn down, which again, in everything I know and in my being is that this would be the wrong thing, because we could repair it and we could give them the money right now to fix the so-called emergency. I felt that I couldn't stand by and just watch that happen. I would not be happy with myself to watch that happen.
No, I understand. But I am trying to imagine myself in this type of situation, because then on the flip side, you said you got a competing bid for the work. And granted, that you have whatever experience that dictates that you think that was an appropriate and a suitable contractor and, a suitable alternative bid, right?
Right.
But kind of in the same vein as my last question, should an outside entity be able to force a private owner of a property to do things the way that they want them to do it and use a contractor that they think is suitable as opposed to one that they picked for themselves? I mean, I'll maintain that the city obviously holds that right over all of us as property owners within the city limits. But should our neighbors also?
Well, I think if I may respond, the second contractor was done in full cooperation and sign off with the church. In fact, Pastor Ferguson led that contractor through and was the one that met with them. So that was not done, behind anyone's back or anything. I
I
also
didn't
want
take
to say,
it that way.
Oh, okay.
I just meant that you're saying that they were able to bring down the price.
Right.
There must have been some trade-offs in there somewhere, or like something. I didn't mean to imply that it was behind anyone's back. I
Oh,
was
okay.
just asking more about, like if I'm a homeowner, my neighbor says, no, you should use this person and they can bring it down. I have to make that decision. Is the money the value to me, or is it that I trust this contractor? And I know, or.
Right. I think, I see what you're getting at. And I want to first emphasize that I have zero ill will towards the church. I want that. And we were working together well up until a certain point when we felt we had put together 3 successive, incredibly generous offers and none were accepted. And it was heartbreaking. And so I think where I would draw the line on private versus public is that this is a historic landmark. And if in fact it is causing an immediate danger to the public, then the church at any one of those moments during the time that we were working together or up until today could have just gone in and made those simple repairs to remove whatever the immediate issue was. So I think it's the public-private divide here, I think really is the historic district where everyone has an obligation. If they want to upgrade their building to a higher standard and can't afford it and want to tear it down, then I would say argue that in front of the Historic Conservation Board, because that's where economic hardship, that's who hears those concerns. What's upsetting here is, again, the emergency demolition. So we don't have the body that everyone else submits to as a part of their contract to the community, that the social contract. That's not part of the equation here.
So you're saying it's the timing, the emergency, and that you could accept it if they went through their certificate of appropriateness process and got a determination.
Yeah.
Thanks. No, that helps, because I was trying to figure out, clearly you guys were all working together at one point, and at some point there was a breakdown, and I feel a lot clearer on that. And I think that's really helpful. Another thing to consider, I don't know the exact year that the historic designation was certified or put on the National Register off the top of my head, but I believe it was in the 60s or 70s. Do you know?
Sure.
Okay.
I think it was the early 80s.
Okay. The fact that it's applied. If you bought a building now that was in a historic district, you'd be well aware of that you were buying a building in a historic zone and that you'd have these extra things. Do you think there's any differentiation for a building that never transferred and has this thing applied to it after the fact?
I think if someone were to purchase a property and then in the next several, 2 to 5 years, have the city or the government come in and say, all right, this is suddenly a historic district, and that would disrupt their plans or their financial return on investment, that would be grounds for someone to have a reason to feel hard done by the government. In this case, it's been established for almost 40 years. And the church, looked into doing historic tax credits, 5 or so years ago. They were very well aware of all of this. And so I don't think their individual liberties were ever violated, if they ever felt that way. I think it was just acceptance that this is the case and it doesn't interfere with our property rights.
I just thought it was an interesting concept, because most of the properties in Over the Rhine that might be protected by this designation have transferred, but at least at some point over time. in terms of like the legal relationship between like you and any property owner that you might donate to, let's say you did some portion of the work, whether it's the immediate need, but the, just to address the immediate stuff, but still ultimately, something should be done to stop the infiltration, and there's a lot more work to be done, right? What if that owner that you're donating to accepts that portion of the gift, but they don't have the wherewithal to continue either complete the work or just to maintain what you've helped them construct? I mean, because like it's an ongoing thing.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I understand your question there, and I'm sensitive to that as well. And part of remember, there's been 3 different proposals, and it gets complicated, but they got progressively more, we tried to do better and better with each successive proposal to address each concern that was being raised. So now I forgot your question. So one of the things we offered early on was, well, could we, 2 things. One, could we help? We would be willing to fundraise for an ongoing maintenance fund as part of the deal. And then that was packaged in. Remember, we also offered to fundraise for the entire Welcome Center and the elevator as a suite, we'll do the whole thing. But another thing we offered was you could split off the tower, and we'll take title to it, and it'll be a historic landmark on its own, a benefit to the community, separate from the church, like a condoization. And I know that might have its own difficulties, but that was a thing that we offered. So we tried to be sensitive to any possible concern. We'll own the church, or we'll set up a separate maintenance fund, or Cincinnati Development or Cincinnati Preservation Association can sort of be the manager, or you guys can continue to own it. We'll put it in, have some sort of bell tower maintenance trust set up. And the problem was it seemed like no matter what we offered or did, 1, we didn't get any communicative response, and 2, when we did officially submit proposals, they were denied.
And I appreciate your level of dedication, and I'm not asking these questions, I'm just trying to think through it. And then
Sure.
Ultimately, though, I guess the church itself is just a contributing member of the neighborhood, right? And then the National Historic designation isn't super specific about which components of the church or of any structure along that. I mean, they mostly talk about maintaining that continuity of the urban fabric and the, at that facade, but you're contending that the bell tower itself is a fundamental portion of the contributing nature of this building. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and if I may just briefly, it's not just me, it's people that have written letters like John Morris Russell urging that it be saved, as the Friends of Music Hall urging that it be saved as it's sort of they say that it has a conversation with Music Hall from across the park. That was their language. Mary Burke Rivers from Over the Rhine Community Housing has urged that it be preserved, and she's a low-income representative. Jim Tarbell, Alicia Kintner from Artswave. Like, it's not just me that says that it's it's important as a landmark and as a presence on Washington Park.
But it specifically is not addressed in the historic designation.
The bell tower itself?
Yeah.
Well, the individual designation lists each individual building, and I honestly don't know what language it uses in regard to that particular building.
It is specifically listed. I'm sorry, I thought I looked it up and I thought it was just like, I didn't think it was listed specifically.
That building, 1208 Race, is individually listed as part of the National Historic District and the local historic district as
Okay.
being contributors to those respective districts. So it's called out in that sense.
Got it. But I mean, the bell tower does sit behind some dimension of the facade proper.
I think I understand what you're saying. I would argue that the bell tower is essential to the composition of what Crapsey and Brown, who are renowned church architects, constructed. That it is, if not the most important feature of the church, then an essential feature of that building.
And I'm an architect. I come from your way of thinking, sorry.
Okay.
But
Hope I'm not being defensive. I'm just nervous.
no, and I apologize, but I feel like we needed to get at the root of some of these things and what's driving the stuff, because, you know, as a licensed architect, health and public, health, safety and welfare are primarily what our license is deals with. You can be a good designer or a bad designer, but you're supposed to keep people safe in the process. So I just wanted to understand, and so we've obviously spent so much time talking about 1208. Are we correct in am I correct in my understanding that if we were not to uphold the orders on 1212, you would want to then go back to the city to try to readdress the orders on 1208? Because I mean, what we're talking about today is not going to change the fate of 1208 without its own process, right?
Madam Chair, with respect to that question, the reason this is important is my understanding is the demolition of 1208 or 1212 without a hearing as a contributing building without a hearing is it simply makes it easier, meaning less expensive to take the tower down. So if you deny it, it would become, it would not be impossible to take the tower down. There were bids for with and without 1212 is my understanding for how much it would cost to take the tower down, and it's just simply more expensive. And so naturally the property owner wanted to go with the less expensive option, get rid of 1212 to do that. Does that make sense?
But yes, but what I understand is that 1212 from the orders, I mean, they're supposed to maintain the street frontage. So it's just a portion of the back of the building, correct?
I think I'm not sure how much. I have heard 2/3 of it. I've heard up to the facade. I've heard it's not the entire building. That's correct.
Okay. But that's no distinction for you guys. You're concerned about 1212 going away as well as the bell tower. Is that accurate?
Our concern is with the bell tower demolition being enabled to be easier through the destruction of another contributing building without a hearing. It's and a contributing building that has no structural deficiencies itself. I've walked through, many people walk through, there's nothing wrong with it, but because it's adjacent, it's been declared an emergency. So that does not seem right.
Okay. So if the orders on 1212 were overturned, would it be your intention to go try to readdress 1208?
I believe
I'm trying to understand what all's at risk here. I'm not trying to pin you
Right.
into anything. Obviously, that'll be its own process. What I'm trying to understand is if that's a done deal and it cannot be opened again, it narrows this discussion significantly. The
Well, I
intent
think-
is to open that one up again. It's a little different.
The intent is to open up the 12. As long as I believe that there's something unjust or again, not saying the church has any ill intentions at all, but that for whatever reason, they can't see the vision to just make the repair and move forward. If that is the case, as long as that this tower is threatened, I will continue to advocate for its preservation. Legally, I don't know. I'd have to defer to Sean what can still be done for 1208. But I would say this: the overturning is certainly relevant because then the cost of demolition becomes more in line with what it should be. It becomes more true rather than simply being made easier to take down a historic landmark by removing another contributing building. So I think
I understand.
I think the church then would look more seriously at just making the repair of the supposed emergency on 1208 if it's going to cost more to even more to tear down the bell tower, or as I put it, more what the true market cost should be, let's say.
Madam Chair, can I jump in real quick?
Please.
I think on the point you just asked, my understanding from earlier, and this might have been the very first day of testimony, but and to the city folks, that I believe a statement was made that the demolition permit that is currently in the city for 1208 cannot be approved without this being approved for 1212 demolition, meaning if this were to be overturned, this is my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if this were to be overturned, the demolition order on 1212, then the city would withhold the permit for demolition on 1208. And so the effective result of overturning the 1212 demolition order, or invalidating the 1212 demolition order, would be to prevent the issuing of the 1208 demolition permit because they are tied together in the city's mind.
Madam Chair, may I respond?
Yes, please.
Respectfully, I believe those addresses may have been flipped the first day of the hearing. I believe at the time the hearing started, the only application that had been submitted was a demolition permit for 1212. So at that time, the city did not have an active application for the bell tower. We do now, but I recall myself saying that what we would not do would be allow for the demolition of 1212 absent a plan for 1208. And I believe the board member has flipped that a little there. So
okay.
The answer is that no, the demolition of 1208 could proceed regardless of the outcome of this hearing.
I didn't hear
Okay,
that
well,
last statement. I'm sorry.
I responded that because there is only an appeal of 1212 currently before the board, a demolition permit for 1208 could be reviewed, could issue regardless of the outcome here. That said, it would require some plan for how that demolition would proceed, with 1212 not being part of it.
Thank you.
And as a matter of thank you. And as a matter of just sort of informing this proceeding, is it the case that the demolition permit for 1208 that is in the city right now, the plan that is with that includes using a 1212 being demolished as described in this order to allow that would be necessary to the plan that's of the 1208 demolition permit plan that is before the city right now?
Madam Chair, if I might. So what we have right now is two permits in 1208, which is the church tower. It is a alteration permit that has selective demolition to it, which would include the tower itself, as well as an alteration permit for 1212, which is a selective demolition of portions of the building, leaving the primary facade in place. The submission of 1208 would have to be modified to show the manner and means that the demolition would occur if the building at 1212 wasn't going to be partially removed.
So if, just to restate, so we're all clear, what Ms. Fauberg said is, and you reiterated, Mr. Dahlberg, is that you wouldn't have, the city wouldn't allow anything to happen to 1212, except as it was related to, like, there would have to be a plan intact that it is in support of the work at 1208. Is that accurate?
Yes.
But the 1208 would have to be modified. The 1208 permit that has been submitted so far would have to be altered if the ability to take 1212 down goes away.
That's correct.
Okay. Luke, did that clear up what your question?
Thanks.
Any more questions from the board for Mr. Klingler at this time? Okay, Mr. Burley.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Sturkey, and thank you for your questions, Madam Chair. You got to a lot of the testimony I was hoping Mr. Klingler to describe today, so I appreciate that, and we are almost done. Mr. Klingler, just to make this crystal clear for the board, Pastor Ferguson stated that the church has to demolish the bell tower because funds are not available to remove life safety concerns. You remember him saying that?
Yes, I do.
And you also heard Mr. Dahlberg say that he would lift the order if either engineer's repairs were made, correct?
Yes.
Do you have money sufficient so that the church could make engineer Dombrowski's repairs?
Yes.
And Pastor Ferguson has told you that he would pledge $300,000 to a repair based on THP's repairs. Is that correct?
Yes, that has been stated.
And his money, with your money combined, could make THP's repairs, correct?
Objection, what repairs are you talking about?
THP's repairs as bid on by Buckeye Construction and Restoration.
Those are not repairs that fix the lateral stability, correct?
Mr. Shadley, please.
I want to know what
Mr.
repairs.
Dahlberg has said he would lift the order if the repairs in phase 1 and 2A of the THP report were made. Those are the repairs I'm asking about now.
Thank you.
Mr. Klingler, is money available to make those repairs?
Yes.
That's all we have. Thank you, Mr. Klingler.
Thank you.
Ross.
1 second, please. I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Okay. Does the board have any further questions for the attorneys before we move into closing?
Well, are these gonna, sorry, Chair,
You're fine, go ahead.
procedurally, is this our time to ask questions and then they'll be closing and then we deliberate, or will we be able to ask questions after closing? Or should we be proposing that, or should we at least try to get all our questions out now? I don't know what's the most efficient way to.
I thought our intention was to try to get all our questions in now and
Okay.
then deliberate after closings.
Yeah, but there's nothing, it really is, again, at the chair's discretion. There's nothing that I think prevents the board members from asking questions before, during, or after closing.
Now
Well-
you just opened up a whole new before, during, and after. So-
It's Madam Chair, it's your discretion.
Sorry.
The code is not specific on this, and I've seen it done in the past, all of those ways.
I appreciate the order the chair is trying to bring to this proceeding. So I don't want to get too far afield. But if we're going to ask questions now, I'll ask some questions now and then go to closing.
I believe it's been difficult to get at the heart of the matter for each of the different parties. And so I think please feel free to ask any questions that you have right now. But if something comes up in the closings that you need clarification on, absolutely, I think we're all trying to do. We've invested a lot in this. We want to make sure we see it through. So.
Yeah. This might be part of your closing, Mr. Studer, Mr. Burley. So if you tell me just to wait, that's fine. But what I'm trying to get at is the way I would understand the sort of crux of this is you're asking the board to say that Mr. Dahlberg's determination that this was an emergency was wrong, was incorrect. And that was, and we have, in some ways, we have two engineers arguing on either side of that, but they're not exactly arguing that question. They're having some bigger argument about, you know, what the total needs for repair are and some other elements. But to me, the sort of jurisdictional, or I don't know right way to say it, but because as you know, I'm not a litigator, but the question we're really truly being asked, the scope of our review has to do with, is that, as I understand it, that's what I want to ask, is that this decision was wrong, was erroneous, and it was so erroneous that it needs to be overturned. And one, is that a correct sort of distillation of the actual, you know, substance of what's being asked? And two, I would ask that if that is what it is, that you sort of make that clear why you think that's wrong in the close, summarizing why you think it was erroneous in the closing statement.
To Member Blocher, yes, you're exactly correct. Our argument is that the 1212 notice, which is tied and linked directly to the 1208 situation, that it is without any factual basis and is contrary to law and its fair interpretation and application. So there has to be a check on you know, all decisions at the city, right? So this is the check on Mr. Dahlberg's decision. Not that he's right or wrong, it's just that there's no factual basis and it's contrary to law and its fair interpretation. So there's, you know, the underpinnings of the order are incorrect. So that's what we'd be arguing, and we will address all of this. And like I said, a packaged closing statement that'll help, hopefully, put this, you know, in a digestible package from our perspective.
Can I ask a clarification on that response?
Sure.
Is that okay? Mr. Studer, I thought I heard you say that you think both orders were wrong or contrary to law. Is that right? But I mean,
well, we're here on the 12.
You're separating. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure.
12 notice. That's what we're asking you to overturn. But the testimony from Mr. Dahlberg was that the 1212 race notice that's been appealed has no basis but for the 1208 race notice. And that's what, you know, so you can't really argue 1212 without 1208. And that's what we were talking about just a few minutes ago. Because 1212, I don't think it's in dispute, has no structural issues whatsoever, and is only on the table for demolition because of the 1208 alleged situation.
Understood. I just wanted to make sure that that was what you intended.
Yes.
Thank you.
And then the other question I'd have to Mr. Shadley is, this might be in your closing statement as well, but if the argument of the appellant hinges on a claim that there's no factual basis for determination of emergency and necessity, what is your response to the passage of time since the original demolition order, in November of 2020?
I think the reason the original order was issued was because Art Dahlberg went to the structure and saw that the girders were a mess. And no one can predict, as Art said, when the building might collapse. But Art determined, based on, I think at least, based upon the girder being so deteriorated and based upon the absence of the ring being connected, the tension ring and the steeple, that there was a real risk that the building or the steeple could come down. And the fact that we're here a year plus later doesn't challenge in any way the fact that there's still that very real risk. No one can identify the day or the time. But like the building that fell, the condominium in Florida, the theater up in Sandusky, the walkway at the Hyatt, when things are defectively built, they're gonna fail. It's just when, we don't know. And just because we can't predict the day and hour doesn't mean that it's still, as Art has determined, an emergency situation.
Thank you. Let me ask one follow-up question on that. Because I think there's been some back and forth between, or at least to me, there's been some back and forth between latent defects and damage.
Mm-hmm.
And it came across clear, Mr. Wilson's view, that this is latently defective. What is not clear to me is whether Mr. Dahlberg's determination, which is what we're being asked to review, not Mr. Wilson's opinion necessarily, is whether the damage that, whether the failings, the concern that Mr. Dahlberg has observed and informed his decision are derived from the latent defects or derived from damage that's occurred.
Yeah,
And those are pretty important distinctions.
yeah, right. My understanding is that Mr. Dahlberg has come to the conclusion this is an emergency because of the degradation of the girders and because of the failure of the post-tension ring to maintain its integrity. It is Mr. Wilson's opinion that there are additional issues, that those two issues are equally important and cause for an emergency, but there are additional issues that are problematic in the view of Mr. Wilson, and that is that the building has a latent defective design in that it cannot sufficiently withstand lateral forces. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, that is helpful. And is it the case, or is it the contention of the appellee that the damage to the girders and the tension ring and the things that you just described that are the basis for Mr. Dahlberg's decision are a sort of a consequence of the latent defect, or okay, they're not necessarily connected.
Well, I'd like to ask Randy Wilson that, but my understanding is they're not directly connected. the deterioration of the girder and the box, the post-tension ring failure themselves separately contribute to and cause the emergency. Mr. Wilson agrees with that opinion and has a second opinion. The latent defect in the design, the inability to get the lateral load sufficiently transferred, is a separate and additional reason there is an emergency.
And the reason I ask is, to me, if this is about a latent defect, like what's been going on for 150 years and why, and it's sort of like inversely confusing, because on the one hand, if it's a latent defect, absolutely, it needs to be fixed. On the other hand, that's been true forever. So it's you know, it's why we here today. Now, if it's because we have just been able to notice it because of certain degradation, that doesn't take away from the emergency of it. It just so happens that only now we can notice it. But putting that aside, if they really are two separate things, in that the degradation is evidence in Mr. Dahlberg's mind, and that's, you know, I don't think the standard is reasonableness, but that's the basis of his decision. He saw the degradation and he made a determination as a professional that he is, that this does pose an imminent risk. Whether it's from a latent defect or not from a latent defect probably doesn't matter, because the point is whether he made the judgment or not, and whether that judgment's based on something or not.
I agree with you. Doesn't matter.
So, but anyway, that's been sort of picking at me throughout this, because I think that there's a certain argument that's been made, and so I'm not trying to signal anything in saying this. There's an argument on one side that says this has been standing forever, nothing has fundamentally has changed, so why are we doing this? Let's just go make these near-term repairs. And the other side that says, and this is what the determination Mr. Dahlberg has made, which is like, whether or not that's true, so I've seen something now that gives me enough concern to issue an immediate order that there's immediate emergency necessary risk. And I don't know how those two things necessarily get reconciled definitively.
May I respond?
Yeah.
What my understanding of Mr. Wilson's position is that there's a couple of different latent defects. One is the inability to resist the lateral forces. The other is the way the steeple was designed, the absence of the tie down, the bad support or inappropriate and weak support for the steeple itself and the rafters that come down from the steeple. Both of those are worsened and more tangible and more risky by the degradation that has occurred over time. To try to answer your question about 100 and some years, you know, the steeple, if the design was a latent defect, as I believe Mr. Wilson testified, that latent defect is a whole lot worse and a much more risky when the post-tension ring, that is to contain the lateral forces, has utterly failed. It's providing nothing that it was supposed to provide and likely did provide over time. So the degradation makes that latent defect, design of the steeple, even more problematic and more imminent concern.
That's helpful. And I appreciate, I mean, just say to everybody, I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but this is very helpful to me to just trying to distill what has been, you know, I don't know, 10, 12 hours of testimony. And particularly for someone like me who's not a structural engineer or an architect. I think it's important to sort of note that both sides, both engineers agree there are, and I'm not, spend a lot of time on this, but agree the building's not safe for people to be in it right now. No one's disputing that, and that there are repairs that have to be made in order for the church to be able to get back in. And I think the church has presented a very compelling argument as to the existential threat this entire process is placing on. So I don't think we're presented with some request that results in one version of this is do nothing, one version of this is tear it down. I think there needs to be, I think there's clearly been an establishment that there needs to be some action taken on the church as soon as possible. And again, I'm not trying to signal anything by what I'm saying there. And I will say, from my perspective, when we first picked up this, we had our first hearing back in whenever that was in October, or was it the beginning of November? When we read through the record that was presented right before the hearing, the day before, to be honest, I was hopeful that that meant that there had been a bunch of discussions and that maybe you guys were going to figure this out together, and that there was going to be some way to make this work, because it seems to me that that's, given that there's an agreement on some level of repair that's absolutely necessary to get the church back in, that could happen. And I'm not, it's not our job to say whether it should or shouldn't, and it's not our job to opine on anything about that, but I will just acknowledge that that seemed to me like a great outcome. But I think we have to weigh, and I'm going to ask a question of the appellant after this long, speech. To me, we have to weigh, we have to answer the narrow question of whether Mr. Dahlberg's decision was based in fact or not. But then we have to, and I think we can't avoid weighing the impact this has on the church as the property owner prior to any designation of historic nature, as an entity that not only has a private purpose, but as they testified, has a pretty big community public purpose, and all those purposes are frustrated right now by the current state of things. That is an interest. That interest is important and has some weight in this process. And then I think that the authority of the chief building inspector has weight, has importance, and I agree with Mr. Suter that there are processes put in place. The purposes of these processes are in part to have a check, to have a quasi-legal, quasi-judicial, whatever you want to describe this thing we do here, check on the authority of the government, that there is an interest in particularly on health safety issues, in that official be able to make decisions and have those decisions be upheld and carried out, and not dragged down in appeals for a sort of interminable amount of time. And so I would ask the appellant, if you were to respond to that being a concern, sort of the authority of the chief building official to make decisions that he or she deems necessary for life safety provisions, how would you if you're asking us to overturn this decision, to find it to be erroneous and without factual basis, how would you, is there a way you would say that that's sort of like, how does that not open the door to all sorts of other second guessing of the chief building official, I guess is, the broadest way to put it. How is this narrowed in doing this?
Mr. Blocher, I think that anybody can challenge a decision or order of the chief building official or any other administrative official in the city. And so it's a part of, the process. Otherwise, the chief building official would be essentially infallible, right? I mean, you could never question his judgment. And this is based in judgment. And it has to be based on fact. And his judgment is important. And we're not challenging his right to issue the emergency abatement order. This is an exception to the requirement to get a certificate of appropriateness. When we're in a historic district like we are here, and in really, not to put a value judgment on the various historic districts, but we're in Over the Rhine, which is an extremely important historic district for the city of Cincinnati. If the property owner wanted to demolish the building, then the typical process is to go through the Historic Conservation Board, get a certificate of appropriateness, and that's the appropriate place where they could argue economic hardship. Look, I've got this 150-year-old building. I just can't make any economic use of it. It's weighing us down. It's killing us. It's bringing our congregation down. I got to get rid of it. That's the argument that you make before the Historic Conservation Board, where there's a desire to make a demolition in a historic district. This we see as an end run around that process. One, because the applicant asked the city for the demolition order, which is highly unusual and is not appropriate, but they did. And they got it because the building official, deemed it to be an exception to the certificate of appropriateness requirement. I think we'll talk about in my closing argument a fair amount about the fact that this isn't urgent, clearly. We're here a year later and the building hasn't been touched by anyone, including the city. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't think we're trying to get to the authority of the chief building official. Of course, the chief building official has to act, but we're questioning whether this is a real emergency. And that's factual. And that's why we're here.
I think that's all I have, and I've talked a lot. for the time being.
I would like to throw something out there, though, to what I just heard. Having worked on a lot of buildings in Over the Rhine, in 1999, I think if we went back in time, I think the value that the citizens or the city placed on Over the Rhine has changed over time. I don't think it's been a steady, oh, this is a public benefit, and that's not necessarily held by all parties. But I would contend, though, that there was a time when a lot of demolition requests probably came from the property owners. So I'm not sure that it's so irregular for it to come that way. And I don't know if we have a way of verifying that, but in my past experience, I think that used to happen a lot.
Yeah, and I think a lot of demolition requests are still coming through to the Historic Conservation Board for certificates of appropriateness based on economic hardship. It's happening much more than some of us in the community would prefer, but it's happening. For a property owner, I think part of this is that there are a lot of buildings in Over the Rhine and in Cincinnati that are in bad shape. Usually the city of Cincinnati would issue repair orders. The property owner would be under obligations to do that. That's kind of what Mr. Dahlberg's first order was. It was an order to abate. It's like, you fix this or we will. And then it turned into, in August, a reissued order that was much more about emergency demolition. But I do think if we allow the slippery slope that Mr. Blocher, I think the more slippery slope is not whether Mr. Dahlberg will get challenged more. The more slippery slope is that we're going to allow property owners with historic buildings to come to the chief building official and say, identify all the problems with this latent and patent and tell me that this is an emergency so I can demolish this without having to go through the public process of getting a COA. That's the slippery slope that has major public implications, in my opinion.
I don't disagree with that, but I think actually the reverse has happened. I think that happened a lot more in the decades past. And I think it happens less frequently now. And I think one of the main questions here is like, I think determining to reverse 1212, if that determination were made, I don't think it necessarily negates 1208 at all, necessarily, but should we, and I think using one to overturn the other that did go through its process is a slippery slope as well, or a precedent that is difficult to deal with after the fact, I guess.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And it may not, Madam Chair. If you all overturn the order for 1212, which is linked to 1208, it may not impede them from abating 1208 by demolition. But that's a bridge we can cross after we resolve this first issue.
That's good, because we do not have time for two bridges today. Sorry. Does anyone else have any other questions?
I just have one, and then hopefully we can move forward. In reading, let me find it here. In reading from chapter 101 for Cincinnati Building Code, as far as how the emergency abatement of dangerous and unsafe conditions, it's 1101 63.4. There's a clause here at the bottom that says, and I'll paraphrase, building or structure or premises located within a historic district, emergency repairs in compliance with chapter 1435, which is historic district of the zoning code, shall be pursued in lieu of demolition whenever reasonable. And I would question whether 1212, whether it's reasonable to demolish 1212. Obviously reasonable's subjective, and I don't envy Mr. Dahlberg having to make these calls. But to me, that says a lot. Something that I keep coming back to.
Was that directed for response to any particular party?
I suppose not. If Mr. Dahlberg wanted to give his reasoning, that would be great. But I he made his decision based on the information he had.
Mr. Dahlberg, would you like to respond?
Madam Chair, so I think the simple answer to it is 1208 is a decision unto its own. 1212 was a subsequent decision, and what we were looking at is subsection 4 off of 1101 63.4, where it says performing any additional abatement activity. And what our determination was we didn't see how the demolition or repair of the bell tower could occur without at least a partial removal of the building that sits at 1212. So the department certainly isn't trying to say that there is something structurally wrong with 1212. We're saying that we have an emergency condition that needs to be dealt with at 1208, and to be able to deal with that, there needs to be a portion of 1212 removed so that you can functionally do that. That's the basis of why we issued the order for 1212. I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you.
Well, to that question, I'm trying to pull up that portion of the code that the standard is, Josh, as I understand the way you just laid out would be that you have to, there has to be a determination that it wasn't reasonable, it wouldn't be reasonable to go through the HCB process.
Correct.
So what Mr. Dahlberg just said to me, the determination that that is satisfied for purposes of 1212 all flows from whether or not it's reasonable. It would be reasonable to go through the HCB process in 1208, because the determination about 1212 is simply it flows from the determination that there's an emergency at 1208. And so the emergency part of this all flows from 1208. And so it really is a question of whether it was reasonable or not for 1208 to go to the HCB. And I'll just say, it really puts this whole thing in a little bit of pickle, because clearly, with the benefit of the passage of time, they could have gone to HCB in the year and a half it's been, or whatever year it's been. That could have happened. I'm not saying like if it had been understood that the demolition permit, or the decision of Mr. Dahlberg was going to have a year to be implemented. Now, having said that, I understood Mr. Dahlberg also just said that, and it's sort of, and or actually Mr. Suter said this, and whether it's fair to say it's accurate, I asked this question to Mr. Dahlberg, that the November 2020 order should not be characterized as a demolition order, but as a repair order. And that it's only the subsequent, I think it was August, or I'm not sure when the second one came, but it's the amended order that is actually should truly be considered the demolition order. Is that an accurate way to characterize those two?
Madam Chair, to the board member, can you clarify, is that a question for Mr. Suter or for the city?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question. Oh.
It's a question. I asked a question of the city, whether that's, I'm choosing to characterize what Mr. Suter said, and I'm asking you if my characterization is correct.
Want me to answer? Would you mind please state the question again?
So in the context of this entire discussion, okay, so I just went through this idea of, Josh raised the question of an element here that Mr. Dahlberg has to satisfy to justify his decision not to issue an emergency order, is that it was not reasonable to go to the HCB. It was not reasonable for them to go to the HCB. And I start out by saying, well, if this demolition order has been in place for a year plus, that seems to argue that it would have been reasonable to go to the HCB, because you presumably could have gone through the HCB between now and the year from the original demolition permit. However, if what was actually originally issued was not a demolition permit, and the emergency, and maybe this really gets at an important question, to me at least, the emergency determination that Mr. Dahlberg has made, from which every other decision flows, including the 1212 order, if the actual emergency determination was not made until the second amended order, then that's the sort of moment from which we should be judging, emergency, passage of time, that's when the actual sort of like determination of emergency was made, which is the determination that the appellant is saying is not based in fact.
Madam Chair, to the board member, I do understand the question. You cannot consider the August 31st, 2021 order with respect to 1208, the bell tower, in a vacuum. It is the case that upon inspection, the chief building official determined that there was an emergency at the bell tower. Mr. Dahlberg testified previously that the city did not take action to abate the nuisance because it was allowing the property owner to engage in these discussions and fundraising efforts with the community. And I would also caution against the reasonableness determination being tied specifically to the HCB. I think it's broader. I think it's the question as, is it reasonable for the city to abate this nuisance via stabilization or demolition or at all? And one item that has not come up, but that should unfortunately have been made part of the record previously, is that there is no funding dedicated to addressing this property for the city, which is why we have not yet taken action.
Okay. I'm taking away from that for purposes of the board's deliberation that the original emergency determination was made in November 2020.
That would be an accurate summarization.
Ms. Fauberg or Mr. Dahlberg, I do have a question that comes out of that. Are we understanding correctly that the determination to issue orders on 12/12 were primarily due to safety concerns for the work that had already been approved at 12/08? And not, I feel like it's been a little bit tried to be characterized as to alleviate financial hardship, or were they equal issues?
Madam Chair, so nothing that we've done deals with economic hardship. This is an emergency condition that needs to be solved. When we looked at 12/12, what we said was, we don't know how you solve the emergency condition at 12/08 without creating some space that is currently occupied by the back end of 12/12.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, may I suggest a quick bio break before we start into arguments?
Yes.
Awesome.
David, do we have to do anything, or can we?
No, we can be in recess 5 minutes. Is that
Yep.
appropriate?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we're just waiting on the city attorney at this point. Okay, I believe we're ready to come back in a session. So are there any more questions from the board members for attorneys on this?
I have one last question. And I guess this is for Mr. Suter, Mr. Burley, and Mr. Klingler. Did you guys ever consider offering to purchase the church as a way of assuming the authority to make these decisions to preserve or not?
Madam Chair, sorry. Yes, I would ask Danny Klingler to respond to that.
Madam Chair, yes, we did consider that, and never put a formal offer in simply because when it was broached, it was like they didn't want to do that.
Okay,
But yeah.
thank you.
Any more questions from the board? Okay. Madam Chair, if you'd prefer, I can be the official timekeeper here. All these arguments will be limited to 15 minutes. Would you prefer I do that, or would you like to do it yourself?
I'm good with you.
Okay, I'll set a timer for 15 minutes for each person. I'll give each side a 2-minute warning when it's getting close to wrapping up. As I said in the email, we're going to start with the city attorney. If the city attorney would like to make any closing remarks, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And I promise I will be very brief. Thankfully, we all had a rather robust discussion just now about the limited scope of this appeal. One of the things that has not been addressed throughout the dozen hours of this hearing is that because 1208, because the orders with respect to the bell tower have not been challenged, it is the case, it is the state of the world that there is an undisputed factual determination that has not been challenged and that at this point procedurally cannot be challenged to this board, that there is an emergency condition at 1208 at the bell tower. This is important because the authority under which the challenged order was issued, this board is required to then look at section 1435-09-5, section C, and go through the process to determine if the order for 1212 comports with that section. That requires that there be a determination that there's an emergency demolition. That exists. That is what the 1208 order is. So really, the scope of this challenge is whether the order issued for 1212 for the partial demolition of 1212 relating specifically to the rear part that would retain the facade for the exclusive purpose of allowing for the abatement of hazardous conditions at the bell tower comports with the procedural requirements of section 1435-09-5, section C. It's quite a dull exercise, but from the plain review of the order, it does. The chief building official and the fire official certified that there was this emergency. They consulted with the urban conservator and made all necessary inquiries to make the determination that as an additional abatement activity related to a hazardous condition, partial demolition of 1212 was appropriate. And that is all I have.
Thank you, Ms. Fauborg. Okay, we will now move on to counsel for the church. Mr. Shadley, the floor is yours.
And my time is 15?
Correct.
Okay, great. May I share a screen?
Yes. I mean, technically you can. That's up to the chair, but technically that is possible.
It's acceptable to me.
Okay. 1 second. Okay, am I sharing? Can you guys see it?
No.
Find that odd. I tested this earlier today. 1 second. Can you see it now?
No.
Share screen.
There we go.
Okay, great. All right. This is the, first of all, I want to thank the board. You guys, I'm told, are volunteers. You have spent hours and you have paid unbelievable attention from your questions. And Sean, I'm sure will agree with this. From your questions, it's clear you have paid attention, and you have paid attention better than judges pay attention. And so we just appreciate it, because I know this is a lot of stuff to get through. So I just want to thank you. So the first question is this: is there a presumption here? This is the portion of the law that controls what you do. You have to first presume the order is valid. This is not my rules. This is what the city code requires. You have to presume it's valid. And then if the burden is on OTR to prove that it's not valid, you have the right, you are empowered to overturn this order on 1212 only if, this is part 2, the board may modify or reverse the decision, order, or adjudication if the board finds one of these 3 things, A, B, or C. The position of OTR is the order is contrary to existing law, A. The question becomes, what is the existing law? Here is the existing law. The building official is required by law to certify in writing that there's an emergency. He did it. The other thing the building official is required to do is such determination, meaning the certification of emergency, is made in accordance with chapter 1101. That's the building code. OTR has, here is where the check is. OTR makes the argument we should have a check on the building official. This is the check. Did he make his determination in accordance with the building code, Cincinnati Municipal Code, chapter 1101? That's the check. They, OTR, have not put on any evidence to indicate that this determination was not made in accordance with the city municipal code. Since they did not make that proof, they cannot carry their burden, which is right here under A, that the decision is contrary to existing law. If the city council who enacted the municipal code had wanted you to empower you, the board, to make a judgment on whether Mr. Dahlberg's determination is accurate or not, whether his engineering judgment is valid or not, city council could have very easily done that. All they had to do was to add to the law a provision that said, you, the board, can overturn the order if you come to the conclusion that the city chief building officer is mistaken or abused his discretion. That is not in the law that governs you. This is the law that governs you, 1108-81-3. You may modify and reverse only if it's proven that what he did is contrary to the law, not if you come to the determination that you disagree with this conclusion, that it is or is not an emergency. What has not happened is any proof that has been put on that the determination by Mr. Dahlberg is not in accordance with the building code, chapter 1101. That's the only way OTR can prevail, that in fact, there's a violation of existing law. Without a violation of existing law, you may not modify or reverse. So in our view, I don't mean to tell you your business, but in our view, the law does not empower you, given these circumstances, and particularly given the observation of Ms. Fayborg, who just indicated that the issue of 1208 and the factual determination of 1208 long ago and unappealed, that an emergency exists, cannot be challenged before this board. That's what Ms. Fayborg just said. Whether it's emergency, and that is the only position OTR is taking, is that this is not an emergency. But whether there's an emergency or not, according to Ms. Fayborg, cannot be challenged before this board because they did not appeal the 1208 order. We certainly agree and support that. I think Ms. Fayborg agrees with us when she says it's really a matter of procedural requirements. The procedural requirements are, did Mr. Dahlberg follow this 1435 09.5? And we know for a fact he certified it in writing. We all see it. And there's been no proof he didn't make it in accordance with the law. So we don't think going to the question of whether there's an emergency is necessary or even allowed because it's not in the statute. If you do, then we need to discuss whether it's an emergency or not. There are two engineers who have come to the judgment there's an emergency. We discovered today, however, that Ms. Dombrowski said something very interesting to me and to you. No one should go in the building until it is repaired. Now think about that. Why? Why should no one go in the building until it's repaired? It has to be because if people go in the building, they may get hurt unknowingly. The only conclusion rationally you can make from that is that there's an emergency, that the building might fall down at any time. I'm going to restate that. Why does Ms. Dombrowski say nobody should go in the building until it's fixed? Unless she believes the building is at risk of falling down. That's the only reason you keep people out of the building. She may not want to didn't want to testify that it's not safe, but the logical conclusion from the position no one should go in until it's repaired is it's at risk of falling down. And we can't tell when it's going to fall down, so nobody go inside. That's what an emergency is. I think by her own admission, she agrees that it's an emergency. And certainly Art Dahlberg agrees with that, and certainly Randy Wilson agrees with that, all of which you've heard. I think there's a factual basis. Mr. Suter says that there has to be a factual basis for the determination of an emergency. The factual basis is eminently clear. It's the photographs. The angle is not just rusted, it's gone. And as Mr. Wilson testified, and no one disputed, if the angle's gone, it's deteriorated and gone, the strength of the beam is compromised by half. Those girders, when I said beam, I meant girders. Those girders could be, they are diminished their strength by a half. And with that, there's an emergency. That's why we can't let people in there until we complete the repairs, according to Randy, according to Art, and according to Ms. Dombrowski. So the factual basis is the photograph. And the determination then comes based on Art's Dahlberg's engineering judgment, it's an emergency, but the photograph makes it clear the angle iron's missing. The photograph makes it clear that the tension ring is totally failed. Those rafters come down and they provide lateral force outwards. The reason they're constrained is the tension ring. That was the design, the initial design. The ring has failed in 3 corners. It doesn't matter if it had failed only in 1 corner. It has totally failed. No one can dispute that. And when the tension ring has failed, it cannot provide what it had provided in the past, and that is control of those lateral forces from the rafters coming down, pushing out. This doesn't mean the brick structure is going to fall down, but that steeple sure is at risk with the tension ring. And that's again why no one should go in the structure, consistent with what Ms. Dombrowski said, until the ring is repaired. Our point is not that Ms. Dombrowski isn't accurate or competent. That is not what we assert. What we assert is that her investigation is not complete. It is based on presumptions, and it is without calculations. And you have to ask yourself, if you're going to rely on Ms. Dombrowski, or better yet, why would you rely on Ms. Dombrowski when her investigation, by her own admission, is incomplete? She doesn't know whether those connections to help the lateral stability resist the lateral forces. She doesn't know if they're even there. And they're all too low really to have an impact on the tower above. Our point is that the opinions of Ms. Dombrowski are based on presumptions and not calculations. And when you have to make a decision that has the safety of our citizens in the balance, I don't think it's good for you to rely on opinions that are based on presumptions and not based on calculations. And even her testimony today that she doesn't know if these girders are 90% diminished in strength or 50% or 10% diminished in strength. Think about that for a second. How can you express in writing and sign and seal something and say it's safe, which she did in many of these letters? How can you say that to the community and put your own name on the line when you don't know if the girders can hold 10% of what they used to hold or 50% or 90% of what they used to hold? How can you say it's safe? I just think she's incomplete. Again, her opinions and her report are based upon presumptions, not based upon calculations. So I think fundamentally, your first question, and one of you asked it intelligently, in my view, what are we doing here? What are our rules? What controls us? What controls you are the statutes. And this is, you must presume it's valid. OTR's got the burden, and you only can modify or reverse if something's contrary to existing law. There's been nothing contrary to existing law. I took the liberty of citing to some questions and answers. This one to me is telling from Ms. Dombrowski. I thought it'd be worthy to review this with you in the remaining minute that I have, or two questions. So there's been some, I think, confusion in the case about what constitutes stabilization versus restoration. Can you describe the difference for the board? Yes, stabilization are structural pairs to make it safe. She has said this needs stabilization. What does that say to you? Her answer tells you the repairs necessary to make the structure safe. I've read some of these to you today. This is an example for the first floor. Do you know for a fact whether the west wall is connected with the sanctuary structure? Do you know that for a fact? I would say that again, I have not seen the structure. But even as I spoke to Randy, the day he and I met, I asked him, was it likely, what was likely supporting the west wall? And he agreed with
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Thank you. He agreed with me there had to be something. But do you know what it is? I do not. And you don't know the amount. This is the important part. You don't know the amount of the lateral load resistance it provides. No, I do not. And she says she was not given permission. Think about that for a second. She says to you, this is back on November 4. We have gone 4 weeks since November 4. Her complaint is, I can't tell whether there's a connection because I wasn't allowed in there to look. She has not in the last 4 weeks asked us to go look. Now ask yourself a question. Why, if she believes she would find what she's presuming exists, why would she not ask us to go back in and find that? The only rational conclusion is that she's concerned it's not there. Why else would she not go in and prove up her allegation, prove up her presumptions? Here's another question and answer. But have you done anything, repeat anything, to determine whether the south wall and whatever it's connected to is able to withstand a lateral load provided if in fact there's a 90-mile-an-hour wind? No, I have done no calculations. Again, it's filled with presumptions. Here, the last sentence where my cursor is, because of time, then you haven't done the calculations to determine whether the bell tower can stay standing 90-mile-an-hour wind. I have not done that calculation. I'm going to take this off and offer a closing remarks. I think what you have to do is place the value of our citizens and their safety ahead of the desire to see a pretty building.
Time, that's 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Council for OTR adopt. Are you ready to proceed?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Sturkey. Thank you, members of the board and members of staff and everyone who's been here. It's been quite an epic Board of Building Appeals trial, one of the most probably. But as you have recognized with your time, this is an important issue for the future of Washington Park, over the Rhine, and the city of Cincinnati as a whole. We're here because of 143509-5. This building's in a historic district, so it doesn't come down, it doesn't get demolished unless it goes before the Historic Conservation Board for a certificate of appropriateness, unless there's emergency demolition that is certified by the chief building official and the fire chief. The demolition is required for the immediate preservation of public safety because of an unsafe or dangerous condition that constitutes an emergency. And Mr. Shadley pointed to 1101-81-.3. You have the right, you have the authority to overrule that emergency demolition determination. As Mr. Shadley said, if it's contrary to existing laws, rules, or regulations, but also, and he didn't read this, and B, if it's contrary to a fair interpretation or application of existing laws, rules, or regulations. We have to look at 1208. Whether your determination about the 1208 notice changes anything about 1208 or not, we have to look at 1208 because it is the sole reason we are here talking about 1212. And the question for the board is, did the chief building official accurately, correctly, under the facts, determine that demolition is required for the immediate preservation of public safety because of an unsafe or dangerous condition? That's what we have to figure out. And we have met our burden that no, indeed, the chief building official's determination is not supported by the facts. So we have to look at both. You have to look behind the 1212 race notice. The facts of the 1208 are behind 1212, and we can't get to the determination of 1212 without looking at 1208. The evidence shows that we've presented, that you've heard, that neither building should come down. Both engineers have prepared proposals for repairs to the bell tower to keep it standing so that it can adorn Washington Park as it has for more than a century. But I know you may be asking, and I know you're asking, well, how can I rule contrary to the chief building official? If his order says there's an emergency that needs to be abated, then there must be an emergency that needs to be abated. Well, you can vacate the order because it is evident that the chief building official doesn't even stand by his own order based on the testimony that you've heard. We'll talk about that. The evidence you heard shows that there is no serious danger, no urgent threat to public safety, and that demolition is not necessary on either building. The elements of the emergency are simply missing. And not one thing has been done to abate this so-called emergency in over a year. But the sky is falling, right? I think we have a Chicken Little problem here. Why isn't the tower falling? Let's start with the element of serious danger. We're not talking about any structural problem, just any structural problem, okay? A lot of buildings have structural problems throughout over the Rhine and throughout the city. It must be a serious danger. So what is the alleged serious danger here? We've established that there is no danger at 1212 Race. We all agree. And we know that the 1212 order is based on the premise that 1208 is at risk of collapsing to the ground immediately. But nobody believes that 1208 is at risk of collapsing to the ground immediately, except perhaps Mr. Randy Wilson. I don't even think Mr. Dahlberg believes that, based on his testimony. The 1208 notice, as it has been amended in August, states that, quote, the bell tower masonry units are deteriorated and failing, and steel structural elements designed to support the tower have rusted and significantly weakened. Yes, the steel box girder has rusted because it faces the outside. The flange is deteriorated. But you heard testimony that the interior of the steel box girder itself is in good shape, and the masonry is intact and in good working condition. I asked Mr. Dahlberg, I asked him, is the stone is a mere veneer, correct? His answer was, it is a veneer. And I asked him, and the layers of brick behind the stone are not sitting on the deteriorated flange, are they? His answer was, it does not appear so. And I asked him, and the interior side of the brick wall was in good condition, right? And he answered the brick component, yes. And I asked him, and the interior side of the steel girder is in good condition, right? And Mr. Dahlberg answered, yes. So my final question to Mr. Dahlberg was, so the load-bearing masonry is intact and in good working condition, right? His answer was correct. So is this why the tower is not falling? Why no one has done anything to address the alleged serious danger? The fact is, the masonry load-bearing walls are sound. They hold up the bell tower. They resist the bell tower's gravity load, which was the primary concern underlying the 1208 notice. Nobody's talking about latent defects or lateral loads except Mr. Wilson. Randy Wilson and his fantastical paper tower. Mr. Dahlberg never once mentioned a latent defect in any of the notices or in any of his testimony. And with respect to lateral loads, you heard quite clearly from Mr. Dahlberg at the first hearing when a member of the board asked, quote, you observe problems with the gravity load, but not the lateral load. Is that right? Mr. Dahlberg answered, that's correct. I saw no telltale signs that we had any type of failure mode dealing with lateral forces. And even as Mr. Wilson admitted, Chapter 34 of the Ohio Building Code does not require consideration of lateral forces for repairs, where there are no signs of distress from lateral forces. Now, Mr. Wilson is free to hold himself to a higher standard, but his overzealous overkill plan exceeds the concerns that allegedly justified issuing the 1208 notice, and by extension, the 1212 notice that we're appealing. Perhaps Mr. Wilson is playing the role of Chicken Little. Mr. Shadley's late attempt to introduce confusion about wind loads is obviously not even an alleged basis of either notice. Mr. Shadley asked Mr. Dahlberg, quote, you indicated you had some concerns over wind load. Do you remember that? Mr. Dahlberg responded quite clearly. I thought my concerns at the last appeal hearing spoke to gravity load, sir. Wind, earthquakes, and latent defects were not considerations underlying either order. The actual stated concern was the gravity load because the masonry was allegedly failing. And Mr. Dahlberg has concluded and testified that this is not actually the case. There is no danger of collapse. There is no serious danger amounting to an emergency. Let's talk about the second element of emergency demolition. That's urgency. The word emergency itself connotates haste, and demolition must be required for the immediate preservation of public safety. Immediate, now. Think of an emergency, any kind of emergency, a car accident, a heart attack, a fire, a riot, declaration of war, a building about to fall down. What do you do in an emergency? You take immediate action. The city addresses emergencies every hour of every day. What you don't do is issue an order and then do nothing to protect the public for over a year. Nothing. Not closing a sidewalk, not closing a street, not bracing the tower, not putting up fencing around the tower, not putting up signs warning of danger, not closing the streetcar stop in front of the church, not even ordering the church vacated. The church did that on their own accord. Nothing. No one has done anything. Not the city, not the church. No one has taken one single step to address this so-called emergency ever. It has been over a year since the church asked Mr. Dahlberg to issue the order so they could avoid the Historic Conservation Board process. Over a year. There is no urgency here. The code requires urgency, required for the immediate preservation of public safety. There is no urgency here from anyone, except for my client, OTR Adopt, who's been feverishly trying to raise money to save the structure. We can only assume that's because everybody else knows that this is not a true emergency. The third and final element is necessity. Demolition must be required for the immediate preservation of public safety. Required, not convenient, not more affordable, required. Every person in this case agrees that demolition is not truly necessary because the bell tower can be made safe through reasonable repairs. Both Mr. Wilson and Ms. Dombrowski proposed detailed repairs to make the bell tower safe. And regardless of which engineer you believe as to the degree of deterioration present in the bell tower, both sides agree that stabilization is possible. And most importantly, you heard from Mr. Dahlberg himself that either plan from either engineer would address his concerns with the bell tower. So I asked him on Monday, so if either Mr. Dombrowski's phase 1 repairs are made or Mr. Wilson's phase 1 and 2A repairs are made, would that address your concerns in your notice of emergency hazard abatement such that you could lift the notice? Mr. Dahlberg's answer, yes. So I asked him, so to reiterate, the repairs in both engineers' reports can be made and would allow you to remove the abatement orders. Is that correct? Mr. Dahlberg's answer, that's correct. Thus, the chief building official himself has admitted that demolition is not required to make the bell tower safe. It is not the only option. As for 1212 Race, whose notice is at issue here, there is no necessity. Mr. Dahlberg's statement about 1212 coming down either way has no basis as he has not personally looked into the issue. You heard from engineer Ms. Dombrowski, who actually proposed a list of repairs that stabilization can occur while leaving 1212 untouched. The substance of Appley's argument is that repairs to the bell tower are cost prohibitive, demolition is required because it's the only practical option. Financial hardship is not an element of emergency demolition. That is nowhere to be found in the elements in 1435-09-5. The municipal code already provides a path for relief from historic preservation requirements. If Pelley doesn't want to deal with the cost of maintaining this beautiful historic structure, it can go to the historic board, apply for a COA based on economic hardship, just like everyone else. We believe this emergency demolition request, which is what they made, is an end run around that process. Now, I objected to the introduction of evidence related to cost as irrelevant. Evidently, Appley today agrees with that, but it came out and cost became an issue in this matter over my objection. Even if cost was relevant, Appley could still not show that demolition is necessary. Necessary, has to happen, the only option. Buckeye Construction and Restoration has provided a quote that said it could perform Ms. Dombrowski's proposed repairs for $373,000 and Mr. Wilson's proposed repairs for $563,000. You heard from Mr. Klingler that the community has nearly $500,000 available to immediately make the bell tower safe. And you heard from the appellee that it will pledge $300,000 towards repairs. So together, that's almost $800,000. Enough money to accomplish either set of repairs. So again, no matter which engineer you believe, money is available to stabilize the bell tower. Demolition is not immediately necessary. So in conclusion, this case is about applying the emergency demolition exception in 1435-09-5. Remember, the general rule in a historic district is no demolition absent a certificate of appropriateness. That is the policy, that is the social contract between all property owners in the historic district. Emergency demolition allows an exception from that rule only where there are these three elements in 143509-5, a serious danger, an urgent threat to public safety that makes demolition immediately necessary. As I've explained, and as you've heard throughout the testimony, that test is not met here. There is no serious danger. The tower is plumb, level, and square with no signs of distortion and has load-bearing masonry walls in good working condition. There is no urgency, as the bell tower has sat untouched for over a year while the city and property owner stood by watching. And there is no necessity. Demolition of the bell tower is not required because repairs can be made with money on hand. And demolition of 1212 isn't required because those repairs can be achieved while leaving 1212 untouched. So for all those reasons, and we appreciate your time very much, because I know you've spent a lot of your free time and not free time here with us, and we appreciate that. But for all these reasons that you've heard throughout this whole process, the emergency demolition simply doesn't apply in this case. The sky is not falling. The 1212 notice is utterly without any factual basis and is contrary to law and its fair interpretation and application. And the board has a responsibility to reverse that notice, and I respectfully ask you to do so. Thank you.
Is there a motion to move to deliberations?
Yes, I make a motion to move to deliberations.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, we'll move to deliberations. For anyone on YouTube, Cassandra, before you do that, for anyone watching on YouTube, if you'll need to refresh your browser when we come back from deliberations, there will be a new window on YouTube and a new video for you to view the outcome. For everyone else who's